Hey guys, tonight we're heading back into the deeply weird, questionably scented and surprisingly well-regulated world of the Middle Ages, where laws were strict, fashion was risky, and bread could literally land you in jail. You might think, how bad could it be? But spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this, at least not without getting fined for your shoes, whipped for kissing in public, or accidentally marrying someone by proxy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That way, I know I'm not just whispering obscure history into the void, and hey, drop your city and current time in the comments. It's always weirdly fun to see who's drifting off to medieval oddities from halfway across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin with a law so oddly specific it reads like a fashion critique. Don't wear purple unless you're royal. Yes, the colour purple, a shade now found on yoga mats and plastic grapes, was once restricted by law to the elite, and for reasons that were more economical than egotistical. In medieval Europe, purple dye wasn't just expensive, it was ridiculously, soul-crushingly rare. Made from the mucus of sea snails, yes, really, the stuff required thousands of mollusks to dye even a single garment. The process smelled terrible, took forever, and the result was honestly kind of a muddy plum unless you got the formula just right. So, the elite said, yeah, we're the only ones who get to smell like salty snails and look important, and boom, sumptuary laws. These were legal codes designed to reinforce social hierarchies by regulating what people could wear, eat, and sometimes even say. You're a blacksmith? You wear brown. A merchant? Maybe dark green if you're doing well. Purple? That was reserved for royalty, bishops, and the kinds of people who literally had the grace of God stapled onto their job title. Wearing it without permission wasn't just frowned upon. It could get you fined, publicly shamed, or worse. And not just the wearer, tailors could be punished for even making illegal clothes. Now what's funny here is that the law didn't just stop at purple. It branched out into other colours and materials too. Silk, fur, embroidered gold, all regulated with the same intensity we now reserve for parking violations. One particularly spicy English law even banned commoners from wearing clothes that had too many buttons, because that was considered flamboyant and above your station. So, if you were a peasant rocking a tunic with extra flair, you might as well have been cosplaying as royalty, and that didn't go over well. Here's the quirky bit. Some of the most well-known rebels of the time broke these fashion laws on purpose just to show off. One famous example, Edward IV of England, who wore Italian-inspired velvet and fur-lined capes that flaunted the very laws he helped enforce. That's like writing parking tickets all day, then double parking your gold carriage outside the castle for fun, and people noticed. Breaking fashion laws became a subtle flex, a way to signal wealth and influence by teetering right on the edge of legality. Now, of course, the scholars love to argue over how strictly these laws were enforced. That's the open debate. Some say they were mostly symbolic, more about reminding the masses of their place than actually punishing individuals. Others point to court records and fines and say, nope, enforcement was real and often harsh. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. In large cities where the elite were feeling especially paranoid, yeah, you'd better not show up in a purple hat. But out in the countryside, where the local lord had bigger problems, like wolves or a poor harvest, your fashion crimes might slide by with a stern glance and a don't do it again. Still, it's strange to think of clothing as illegal, right? Imagine opening your closet and realising that, depending on your social rank, half of it could get you arrested. The shirt you're wearing right now, if it's dyed, synthetic, or has a logo, you'd already be in trouble, and that's what makes this whole system so perfectly medieval. It wasn't just about utility. Clothes were identity. They told the world who you were, where you stood, and what laws applied to you. And in a world obsessed with order and divine right, messing with that structure was seen as a threat to more than just fashion. It was a threat to God's plan. You wander through the muddy streets of a medieval city, cloak drawn tight against the damp air. As you pass market stalls filled with root vegetables and suspiciously sleepy chickens, a man walks by wearing a dull brown tunic. You think nothing of it, until a constable appears out of nowhere, inspecting tunics like they're contraband. The man's belt is too ornate, his boots laced with leather that looks too good. A fine is issued on the spot. The man grumbles but hands over a copper coin, knowing better than to argue. You slip away, suddenly aware of your own outfit. That deep violet scarf you picked up in the last village? Yeah. You quickly stuff it into your satchel, heart pounding a little harder. Welcome to a world where fashion is politics, colour is currency, and breaking dress code is a literal crime. Oh, and just wait till we get to pointy shoes. Okay, so you've survived the purple police? Barely. But don't get too comfortable, because tonight's next medieval gem is somehow even weirder. Imagine being told that you could not take a bath on certain days of the week. Like, you're about to get into your wooden tub, you've hauled the hot water, sprinkled in your fancy herbs, and then boom, nope, it's Wednesday. And in parts of medieval Europe that might have meant bathing was considered suspicious. So, what gives? Well, hygiene in the Middle Ages wasn't non-existent like people sometimes joke, it was just complicated. Public bathhouses were a thing. Soap existed. People wanted to smell decent, at least by their standards. But somewhere along the line, religious suspicion and public health paranoia created a murky mix of bath-related laws that often made cleanliness seem morally questionable, especially if you were enjoying it. Bathhouses, you see, had a bit of a reputation. They were communal, often co-ed, and sometimes doubled as, let's say, lightly supervised social clubs. Yeah. Not all of them, of course, but enough that the church got nervous. So restrictions started popping up, days when bathing was banned, hours that were deemed inappropriate, and in some cases outright prohibitions depending on your class or gender. In France, some towns discouraged bathing on Wednesdays and Fridays because they were considered holy days, meant for fasting and prayer, not scrubbing your armpits in mixed company. And here's where it gets even more awkward. Medical beliefs of the time suggested that bathing could make you sick. The logic, if you can call it that, was that hot water opened your pores, which then let in bad air or miasma, the invisible gunk they thought caused disease. So ironically, you trying to stay clean might have been viewed as you making yourself more vulnerable. You weren't being hygienic, you were tempting fate. One weird story comes from England, where King Henry IV reportedly avoided bathing because of fears that water would loosen his humours. Not like his sense of humour, his bodily humours. The ancient Greek theory of health involved balancing black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, yum, and people actually thought too much hot water could mess that up. To be fair, if you'd lived through a few plagues and saw healthy people randomly die after bathhouse visits, you might start connecting dots that aren't actually connected too. Now, to be fair, not all bath-related laws were meant to ruin your skincare routine. Some had decent intentions, especially in big cities where shared bathhouses could become breeding grounds for disease if not cleaned properly. A few towns required bathhouse owners to dump and replace water daily or face fines. Others banned sick people from entering public tubs altogether, which honestly feels reasonable. But then came the side laws, like one town in Bohemia where you weren't allowed to bathe at all during Lent because it was considered indulgent. And yes, some areas even fined people for bathing at night, when it was harder to supervise what else might be going on behind those steamy walls. Here's a weird one. In parts of 14th century Germany, it was actually a punishable offence to heat bath water too hot. The logic? Steam encouraged lascivious behaviour. So, yes, medieval lawmakers were out here rating water temperature on the sin scale. Lukewarm? You're fine. Hot and steamy? You're probably summoning the devil. The quirky twist. Some monasteries actually kept strict bathing schedules for monks, certainly not daily, but structured and documented. One particularly meticulous abbey had a rule allowing monks 4 baths per year, unless they were sick or had travelled more than 20 leagues. At that point, you could squeeze in a bonus wash. Congratulations, you earned it. Now for the scholarly debate. Were people actually dirtier than we imagine? Or is that a myth? Historians argue over this constantly. The filthy medieval peasant stereotype probably comes more from Victorian-era bias than from actual fact. Archaeological evidence shows that many people did wash regularly, especially in warm months, and especially if they had access to a river or public bath. Soap made from animal fat and ash was commonly used, even traded. But yeah, if you were dirt poor, living in a thatched hut with no well nearby, you were probably a little crunchy. Still, the idea that medieval folks just never bathed is a bit overcooked. In fact, in warmer regions like parts of Spain or Italy, frequent bathing was the norm, until, again, Religious pressure and fears of disease started flipping the script. By the late Middle Ages, being too clean might make people look at you sideways. It became associated with vanity, worldliness, or even prostitution. So, if you showed up looking particularly fresh-faced and floral, someone might mutter, "Must have been at the bathhouse again," and not in a complimentary way. You walk into a village bathhouse, steam rising, chatter bouncing off the damp wooden walls. Men and women in thin linen robes shuffle between hot tubs and basins, scrubbing with rough cloths, chatting about politics, gossiping about neighbours. Then a town official enters. He checks the hourglass by the door. "Wednesday," he announces, "no new baths today." Groans ripple through the room as people step out, dripping and annoyed. One woman huffs, "My humours were just settling." You leave quietly, your own robes clinging to you, wondering if smelling like rosemary and goat soap is really worth the spiritual risk. So yeah, next time you complain about someone not showering after the gym, remember, in medieval Europe, there were days you literally weren't allowed to, unless you were a monk who'd walk 20 leagues, in which case, treat yourself. Now let's say you've made it through the fashion police and survived the bath bans. You're still alive, slightly musty, but doing your best. You've earned yourself a treat. A nice crusty loaf of warm, fresh bread. But not so fast. Because in medieval towns, bread was serious business. Like criminally serious. In fact, there were entire systems in place to regulate baking, and if you messed up a loaf, too small, too light, too burnt, you might just find yourself face to face with something called the bread police. No, they didn't wear capes made of rye crust or ride horses made of sourdough, though that would be amazing. These were actual town officials tasked with inspecting, weighing, and even tasting bread sold at markets. Their job? Make sure bakers weren't cheating people. You see, bread wasn't just a side item in the medieval diet, it was the diet, especially for the poor. For many peasants, it made up over 70% of their daily calories, so if your daily loaf was short by even an ounce, that mattered. A lot. And because bakers were human and tempted by profit, laws were created to stop them from skimping. In England, this led to the famous Assize of Bread and Ale, a law that, among other things, fixed bread prices according to the cost of wheat. If wheat was cheap, bread had to be cheaper. If it was expensive, prices could rise, but only within strict limits. The penalties? Fines, public shaming, or being forced to give away free bread. And sometimes they just straight up nail your bad bread to your shop's front door with a sign that said cheater, not a great Yelp review. Now here's the quirky little workaround. The baker's dozen. 13 items instead of 12. That originated because bakers were so worried about accidentally underweight bread and getting punished, they started throwing in an extra loaf just to be safe. Not because they were generous, because they were terrified. It was a preemptive bribe to the bread police. Here's your order, plus a bonus, please don't ruin me financially. Some towns even had designated bread weighers, officials with little iron weights and portable scales. They'd walk from stall to stall like snobby food critics crossed with accountants. If your bread came in light, they could confiscate your stock, or worse, sentence you to the pillory, those wooden head and arm traps where people would throw things at you, over carbs. Imagine being publicly pelted with spoiled turnips because your rye loaf was 2 ounces short. Medieval Yelp was brutal. Now the rules didn't just apply to weight, they applied to ingredients too. The bread had to be pure, no filler, no mystery flour. Some bakers would try sneaky things like cutting their wheat flour with ground beans or chalk to stretch their supply, which was, shockingly, not great for anyone eating it. If they got caught, they'd be banned from baking for life, or made to eat their own bad bread in front of a jeering crowd. One famous case in France involved a baker who added powdered bone to stretch his flour and ended up, well, let's just say he got very acquainted with the local dungeon. And here's where the debate comes in. Were these strict regulations effective, or just performative? Some scholars argue that most towns couldn't actually enforce bread laws consistently, especially during famine or war. A lot depended on whether the local lord was paying attention. In lean times, regulations were sometimes relaxed, and people knew they were being cheated but accepted it because, hey, bad bread is better than no bread. Others point out that detailed town records show regular inspections, consistent fines, and a pretty intense paper trail. So maybe enforcement was real, and the baker's dozen wasn't just tradition, it was a necessity for survival in the crusty underworld of medieval law. One particularly grim but true example. In 1266, during a period of food scarcity in London, multiple bakers were publicly executed for selling underweight loaves. Executed. For bread. It sends a very clear message: mess with carbs, and we mess with you. You walk into the medieval marketplace, drawn by the smell of fresh bread wafting from a timber-framed stall. The baker, a stout woman with flour streaks on her cheeks, hands you a loaf with a practiced smile. As you turn it in your hands, a man in a dark cloak appears beside you. He's not shopping, he's inspecting. He takes the loaf from you, sets it on a scale he pulls from his pouch, and waits. Everyone around the stall holds their breath. It's light, by half an ounce. The baker's face goes pale. The inspector raises an eyebrow and scribbles something on a parchment. "Doctor half dozen," he says flatly. The woman nods, already setting aside 6 loaves to be given to the poor as penalty. The inspector vanishes back into the crowd like bread-themed Batman. You hold your loaf closer, suddenly aware that it might be the most law-abiding thing you'll eat all week. Oh, and just wait till we get to ale. If you thought bread was heavily policed, alcohol in the Middle Ages was under an entire different league of scrutiny. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have curfews to break and shoes to measure. Still, next time someone hands you a baker's dozen and says, "Just a little extra, now you know," that humble bonus bun, it's not just kindness, it's survival. So, let's say you've dodged the bread police, snuck in a weekday bath without divine retribution, and resisted the seductive pull of a royal purple. You might think you've earned yourself a peaceful night. Maybe sit by the fire, sip some ale, drift off to the sounds of horses clomping and distant lute music. But no, because guess what? It's curfew. And in many medieval towns, curfew wasn't just your mum yelling down the stairs. It was an actual law, enforced by bells, fines, and a weird obsession with making sure people went to bed at a godly hour. The word curfew actually comes from the old French phrase couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. And no, that's not poetic, it's incredibly literal. At a certain hour every night, usually right after sunset, a bell would ring across town, and that was your official signal to stop what you were doing, snuff out all your candles and hearth fires and go to bed. Or at least pretend to. This wasn't just about keeping people out of trouble, it was about fire prevention. In towns built mostly from wood, straw and hope, fire was a constant threat. One poorly maintained fireplace, one candle knocked over by a dog, and boom, your whole street goes up like kindling. So curfew wasn't just about controlling people, it was about controlling flames. After the bell rang, no one was supposed to keep open flames going unless they had a good reason, and yes, someone might knock on your door to check. The curfew bell itself became a kind of public timekeeper. Most people didn't have clocks, obviously, so the bell was how they knew it was officially time to call it a day. In larger towns, it might be rung from the church tower or a city gatehouse, and it had a very distinctive tone. Low, slow, ominous. Not the peppy ding-dong of a happy church bell. More like, go inside, or else. And here's the funny twist. Curfew didn't just tell you when to go to bed. In many places, it also told you when it was safe to start your fire again the next morning. Yeah. There was a wake-up bell. It was like being in the world's least fun summer camp, where someone controlled your fire privileges and the punishment for breaking the rules was occasionally very serious. In some towns, fines were handed out for any visible smoke after the evening bell. In others, repeat offenders could be imprisoned or lose their trading license. The quirky bit. In certain towns, wealthy citizens could pay for a fire permit, which allowed them to keep a small flame going after hours. These permits were rare, expensive, and definitely a flex. If your neighbours saw a faint glow from your windows at midnight, they might mutter, "Ah, rich folk with their midnight soup." It was a class thing, because of course it was. Even bedtime had a hierarchy. And now, of course, we arrive at the scholarly debate. How strictly was curfew enforced? As with many medieval laws, enforcement varied wildly. In some well-organised towns, night watchmen patrolled the streets specifically to enforce curfew, peeking into windows, sniffing for smoke, or literally listening for the telltale crackle of an illicit flame. In smaller or poorer villages, curfew might have been more symbolic, something people nodded at but didn't follow too closely unless someone got caught or something caught fire. But there are records, town ordinances, guild regulations, court documents. These things mention curfews with all the seriousness of a tax audit. One 13th century London record even lists a man fined for tending his fire past the second bell, and another for loitering in the square without lantern nor purpose. Without lantern nor purpose, imagine getting legally roasted for just vibing. Still, curfew wasn't always a punishment. Some saw it as a mercy. The world outside your door at night? Not ideal. No street lamps, no police force, and a pretty solid chance that if you wandered too far from home, you'd meet a stray dog, a bored thief, or a literal wandering pig, which were known to attack people. Not exactly nightlife worth staying up for. You're in a small English town as the sun sets. The light shifts from amber to dull grey, and you hear it. That deep, resonant bell, echoing from the church tower. Around you, market stalls start closing. People hurry down cobbled alleys, shutters bang shut, and a faint whisper of smoke rises from dozens of chimneys one last time before the fires are covered. A boy with a cart full of ash scoops trundles past, and an older woman leans out of her door to remind you, no lights after the bell, love, unless you fancy the stocks. You duck into your inn just as the final toll rings out. The mood changes, streets go quiet, and somewhere outside, a watchman clinks along in his armour, lantern swinging, eyes peeled for rebels with soup pots. Of course, as with many medieval laws, there were always those who found a way to bend the rules. Innkeepers might keep the kitchen fires going longer if they had guests from out of town. Smiths sometimes got emergency permits to work at night if a lord's horse threw a shoe. And the clergy? Oh, they could burn candles all night for prayers. Was it always for prayer? Let's just say, there are letters that suggest otherwise. Still, the curfew bell rang on every single night for centuries. In some towns you can still hear it today, though now it's mostly ceremonial. A quaint little nod to a time when fire, fear and bedtime were all managed by one ominous sound echoing through the rooftops. So next time you stay up too late scrolling your phone, think about medieval curfew. No glowing screens, just a law telling you to smother your hearth, hide your candles, and be grateful you weren't rich enough to need soup after dark. So after surviving the bedtime bell and slipping off to sleep before the town watch caught a whiff of your midnight stew, you wake up ready to tackle a brand new day in medieval life. Maybe today's the day you make some money, flirt a little at the market, or finally try that mysterious meat pie. But if it's Sunday, well, bad luck, because there's a whole new set of rules waiting to slam the brakes on whatever fun you had planned. And if you happen to be a butcher, congratulations. You're absolutely not allowed to work today, because medieval people were very serious about their weekends, or at least one particular day of the week when God was supposedly watching extra closely. Now, keep in mind, this was long before the concept of a 5-day work week or a lazy Sunday brunch. You worked when there was work to be done, and rested only when your body, or the weather, forced you to. But then came the Sabbath laws, deeply rooted in Christian doctrine and interpreted by medieval governments in increasingly intense and, let's be honest, sometimes hilariously specific ways. Chief among them? Sunday was the Lord's Day, which meant no unnecessary labour and definitely no chopping up carcasses. Butchers in particular got called out a lot. Why? Well, their work was messy, public, and involved a whole lot of visible blood. Not exactly the kind of thing the church wanted people witnessing on a day dedicated to spiritual cleanliness. Plus, the sound of cleavers smacking into bone and the smell of boiling tallow didn't exactly set the mood for prayer. So, in many towns, local laws strictly prohibited butchers from operating on Sundays. No slaughtering, no selling, no nothing. Violations meant fines, suspension of licenses, or in more extreme cases, having your tools publicly confiscated. Yes, that means someone might walk through town holding your blood-stained cleaver like it was a war trophy. Butchers weren't the only ones targeted. In some towns, all forms of manual labour were banned on Sundays. Farming, blacksmithing, brewing, you name it. The idea was to enforce rest, but the way they drew the line was strange. You could walk to church, of course. You could eat food as long as it was prepared in advance. You could even gossip in the churchyard. But cut a piece of wood? Fine. Open your shop window? Fine. Try to sneak in a little post-sermon business on the side? Fined and shamed. Now here's where things get weird. These laws sometimes got so specific they bordered on absurd. In 14th century London, there was an ordinance stating that no animal could be slaughtered in public on a Sunday, but if it was absolutely necessary for the health of the town, it had to be done in the shadows, under cloth. Imagine that. Secret butcher operations happening behind sheets in alleyways so that God wouldn't see. Or worse, so that the local priest wouldn't. There's a quirky story from France where a butcher tried to argue that his cow had died accidentally on Sunday morning, and he was just trying to honour the meat by not wasting it. The local magistrate disagreed, fined him 2 silver coins and ordered the carcass given to the poor, which is kind of a win-win? Maybe. Then there were loopholes. In some areas, nobles could have meat prepared for them on Sundays by their servants, because of course rules were different for the rich. That's kind of a running theme. Sumptuary laws applied to peasants, bathing restrictions, more for the common folk, Sabbath laws. Nobles conveniently forgot them when their roast duck needed basting. Here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Did these laws actually reflect genuine religious devotion, or were they more about social control? Some historians argue that Sabbath laws were a sincere attempt to give working people a break and protect religious observance. Others say, no, this was about controlling the lower classes and making sure they didn't get too independent or wealthy. Because think about it. If only certain trades are forced to close on certain days, it changes who gets ahead economically. Sunday off sounds nice until you realise it means you lose a day of profit, while the noble across the street just paid someone else to keep the gravy flowing. One interesting fact. Sabbath laws actually evolved over time and got stricter in some places as urban centres grew. As towns became more crowded, church leaders became more anxious about worldly distractions. So laws that had once simply asked for rest started demanding silence, banning music, dancing, even public laughter. Imagine being fined for giggling too loud on a Sunday. It happened. A man in York was once cited for indecent mirth outside the cathedral. That's right, he laughed wrong. You find yourself in a bustling Saturday market, meat stalls crowded with shoppers. The butcher, an old man with arms like hams, wipes his blade and says, "Better get your beef today, friend. Tomorrow's the Lord's Day." You nod, pick out a salted cut and glance at a sign nailed to the stall. No sale on Sundays, by order of the town council. Sunday morning rolls around. The streets are quiet. The smell of incense wafts from the church. But behind one shuttered shop you catch a glimpse of movement. The butcher is inside, slicing something by candlelight. You lock eyes through the window. He gives you a wink, a finger to his lips. This is meat, on the black market. And so, Sundays in medieval towns weren't always peaceful. They were tense. A day of surveillance, of whispered deals, of trying to remember whether churning butter was considered labour. Butchers had it rough, no question. Blood and bones weren't welcome on the Lord's Day. And if you broke the rules, you'd better hope your neighbours liked you enough not to snitch. So the next time you bite into a Sunday roast, remember that somewhere in 13th century Europe, a butcher probably risked public shame and divine wrath just so someone like you could enjoy a lamb shank while pretending to nap through church. All right, you've now survived Sabbath meat bans, dodged curfews, and learned that bread and bathwater both came with legal disclaimers. But let's say you've got someone special in your life. You're not wearing purple, you're keeping your shoes modest, and you've finally got enough coin to take your sweetheart on a scenic stroll through the market square. Maybe a little hand-holding, a shy smile, and... Wait, did you just kiss in public? Yeah, well, congratulations, you might have just broken the law. Because in some medieval towns, public displays of affection were flat out illegal, and it didn't matter if you were deeply in love, betrothed, or even married. The reasoning? Morality. Or more precisely, the appearance of morality. The church wasn't just concerned with what you were doing behind closed doors, they were deeply invested in how you behaved in public. Because outward behaviour, they believed, reflected inward purity. So if you were locking lips in front of the candle shop, that wasn't romantic, it was scandalous. And laws existed to curb it. In some places, these rules were baked into the town ordinances. No kissing in public, no suggestive touching, and definitely no lingering stares that went on too long. Sounds ridiculous now, but back then, it was part of a much larger system of behavioural control. You were expected to act with restraint, decency, and an ever-present awareness that God, or at least a very nosy neighbour, was watching. And it wasn't just the church wagging its finger. In many cities, secular governments joined in, passing civil laws to reinforce public decency. In 14th century Florence, for example, the Office of the Knight was literally a legal body tasked with policing sexual behaviour, particularly among unmarried couples. These guys were out at night, watching alleyways, listening through windows, and absolutely ready to drag someone into court for inappropriate behaviour. Can you imagine being hauled into a courtroom for kissing your fiancée too enthusiastically? Because it happened. Frequently. Now, before you think this was all about religious uptightness, let's look at the quirky economic angle. In certain areas, public kissing was associated with courting rituals, and courting rituals came with expectations, mostly financial ones. A kiss wasn't just a kiss, it was a declaration of intent. It implied engagement, and if you gave that impression and then didn't follow through with marriage, you could be accused of fraud. That's right, romantic fraud. There were cases where women sued men who kissed them in public and then failed to propose. He said he loved me was not just heartbreak. It could be a legal argument, and sometimes it worked. There were also class implications. The nobility could get away with a little flirtation, maybe a hidden kiss in a corridor, maybe a dramatic hand kiss to feast. But for commoners, PDA was often policed harshly, especially if it crossed class lines. A noble kissing a servant in public, that would cause a scandal. A servant kissing a noble, that could lead to public punishment, whippings, fines, or exile. Because in their minds, romance wasn't just about feelings, it was about order, and kissing outside your station was like trying to wear silk when you belonged in wool, a social offence and a legal one. Let's not forget the open scholarly debate here. Were these laws enforced consistently, or were they mostly performative scare tactics? Some historians argue that a lot of PDA laws were symbolic, meant to reinforce ideals of purity and morality more than to catch actual offenders. Others point to detailed court records that show real people being fined, punished, and shamed for public affection. In one German city, a man was put in the pillory for embracing his betrothed too boldly in the daylight, which sounds like an awkward wedding toast waiting to happen. And then there's the case of reverse enforcement, where a couple was expected to show affection as proof of legitimate marriage. In a few parts of rural England, local tradition required newlyweds to kiss in front of the entire village as proof that the marriage had been consummated, or was at least heading that way. So, imagine spending years trying not to kiss in public, and then suddenly being forced to do it while old women throw rice at you and someone plays a lute off key. You find yourself in a bustling medieval square. Bakers shout, pigs trot freely underfoot, and music plays from a nearby tavern. Your hand brushes the hand of someone you like. You glance around. No priest in sight, no watchman, just market noise and the smell of spiced apples. You lean in, kiss them softly, and for a moment, it's perfect. Then you hear it. A cough. Behind you stands a town official, arms crossed, with a fine parchment already half filled. "That'll be 2 copper for inappropriate conduct," he says, not even looking up. The couple next to you gasps. "But they're married," someone whispers. "Doesn't matter. The law is the law, and today, the law has no chill." Now here's a juicy little twist. Some of these rules evolved directly from earlier Roman law, which had similar regulations around public behaviour and morality. The idea that love should be private, modest, and controlled had been floating around for centuries. But in the Middle Ages, with religion running the show, that idea got a whole lot louder. Priests preached against unseemly displays, and warned that even innocent touch could awaken sinful thoughts. And let's not even get into what they thought about dancing. That's coming up soon, don't worry. But what does this tell us about the time? It tells us that love wasn't just personal, it was political, spiritual, and public, and that even something as simple as a kiss had layers of meaning. It could be a promise, a scandal, or a sin, depending on who was watching. So yeah, if you ever felt awkward about PDA at your high school prom, imagine doing it in a world where someone might literally drag you to court for it. Love was dangerous, romance was risky, and medieval couples, they had to be sneakier than most. Alright, so now you know that in the Middle Ages even love had legal limits, and every kiss could come with a side of paperwork. But what if, instead of flirting in the marketplace, you preferred to spend your time with your nose in a book learning Latin, and maybe trying to write something clever in the margins with a quill that smells faintly of goat? Well, good for you. Except be careful, because in some parts of medieval Europe, speaking Latin without permission was basically asking for trouble. That's right, the language of scholars, monks, and holy writ, off limits to just any random peasant. If you didn't have the right credentials, using Latin could get you fined, shunned, or accused of pretending to be something you weren't. Let's get into the why. Latin was, at this point in history, the language of power. It was used in religious services, legal documents, medicine, science, philosophy, all the good stuff. If you could speak or write in Latin, it signalled that you had education, access, and likely belonged to the clergy or the intellectual elite. It was like having a graduate degree that also gave you the keys to every library and courtroom in Europe. And if you didn't belong to that group but tried to act like you did, you were crossing a very serious line. In some regions, especially where universities and monastic schools held sway, using Latin without being a cleric or academic was seen as a kind of social fraud. Think of it like crashing a fancy dinner party in a tuxedo you borrowed from your cousin. You might look the part, but if someone catches on, you're getting kicked out. In fact, there are records of people being banned from speaking Latin in public if they weren't of the cloth. Sometimes these rules were written down, other times they were just understood. A kind of social minefield for anyone too curious with a tongue too sharp. Why so protective? Well, Latin wasn't just a language, it was gatekeeping in verbal form. It kept outsiders out of important conversations, legal proceedings, and theological debates. If you couldn't understand it, you couldn't participate, and that was very much the point. Most people spoke the local vernacular: English, French, German, Flemish, whatever. Latin was a different world. A cleric could read a will aloud at a funeral, and no one would question a word of it, even if he was sneaking in a clause that gave the church an extra cow. Here's the quirky fact of the day. Some monasteries invented their own internal dialects of Latin, essentially church slang, so that even if an outsider did know Latin, they'd still be confused. It was like Pig Latin, but with more judgment. These altered forms were often used in the internal documents or whispered during disciplinary meetings, just to make sure Brother Thomas didn't leak gossip to the stable boys. Even stranger, there were moments in history where women were explicitly banned from learning Latin in certain schools or monasteries. The reasoning? That women couldn't be trusted with a language that gave them access to philosophical and religious texts, which, to be clear, is a weird and uncomfortable way of admitting Latin was powerful. So powerful, in fact, that it had to be protected like a medieval nuclear code. Now for the scholarly debate. Was this all formalised, or more of a social taboo? Some researchers argue that there weren't many written laws explicitly banning non-clergy from speaking Latin. It was more of an enforced cultural rule, a kind of know-your-place system, policed not by the state but by social scorn. Others point to a few town charters and ecclesiastical records that do seem to suggest actual policies about who could legally translate or recite Latin in public. So, like many things in medieval law, it was probably a bit of both, some rules written down, others carved deep into custom. It gets even more tangled when you bring in the wandering scholars, young men who had some university training but no money, no degree, and way too much time. These guys would drift from town to town, quoting Latin poetry in taverns to impress girls, or scamming locals by pretending to be messengers from bishops. They were seen as dangerous, not because they were violent, but because they had words, knowledge. And in a world where the majority couldn't read their own names, that was power. Scrawny guys with ink-stained fingers could be as threatening as armoured knights, depending on what came out of their mouths. You find yourself walking through a university town, its narrow cobbled streets lined with dusty bookshops and ink-streaked students. You hear a young man reciting Latin aloud in the square, his gestures theatrical, his tone exaggerated. A small crowd gathers. Some laugh, others murmur disapproval. A priest crosses his arms nearby, frowning. "Who is your master?" he asks the boy. "Who gave you license to speak like that?" The student bows mockingly. "Virgil," he says, "and perhaps a bit of Cicero." That earns him a warning, and a very stern lecture on the importance of humility and knowing one's place. In the shadows, a scribe watches silently. He knows the Latin was flawless. But that doesn't matter here. Eventually, Latin did become more accessible, especially as the Renaissance unfolded and printing presses exploded across Europe. But in the thick of the Middle Ages, it was cloaked in ritual and control. Even if you taught yourself the words, you hadn't earned the right to use them, and the people who decided whether you had that right, yeah, they were the ones already speaking it fluently. So next time you try to impress someone with your old high school Latin, carpe diem or whatever, just remember, once upon a time those two little words might have landed you a fine, a lecture, or a solid shove out of the room. In the medieval world, it wasn't just what you said, it was who you were allowed to be while saying it. So, after carefully avoiding forbidden languages and making sure your Latin recitations don't offend the nearest monk, you stroll back to your cottage, or maybe your workshop, feeling confident. But just as you're passing by a blacksmith stall, your eye catches something strange. A man being harassed not for stealing, not for swearing, not even for kissing someone in public, but for his shoes. More specifically, because the toes of his shoes are too pointy. Yes, you heard that right. In medieval Europe, there were actual laws that regulated the shape of your footwear, and if your shoe curled too far past your actual toes, you could get fined, mocked, or even banned from certain buildings. Welcome to the utterly ridiculous, but also totally real, pointy shoe crisis. Let's take a little step back, or maybe a dainty toe-forward prance. Around the 14th century, a fashion trend swept across Europe. The poulain, also known as the Krakow shoe. These were long, narrow shoes with extended, curved toes that sometimes reached up to 2 feet beyond the actual foot. They started with the nobility, of course, because who else would turn walking into a balancing act for the sake of looking fabulous? But soon, like all good trends, the style trickled down to the merchant class and then even lower. Suddenly peasants were hobbling around in curly-toed monstrosities that served no functional purpose but made you look just a bit more like a prince. Cue the outrage. Church leaders, city councils, and even kings saw these shoes as a threat to morality and order. I mean, if peasants were wearing stylish shoes, what was next? Gold belts, flavoured bread, dogs in hats. The horror. So laws were passed. Sumptuary laws, the same types that restricted fabrics and colours, but this time aimed directly at your toes. In 1463, for example, King Edward IV of England passed a decree that limited the length of shoe points to 2 inches for commoners. Only nobles of high rank were allowed to wear poulains with longer tips, and even then, they had to be careful not to go full clown mode. Enforcement varied, but the message was clear. Shoes were a status symbol, and status needed to be enforced at ground level. Now here's the quirky side of the story. The longer the shoe, the more impractical it became. Some nobles reportedly tied the tips of their poulains to their garters just to keep them from dragging through mud or tripping them in doorways. Imagine trying to run from a fire or dodge a horse cart with your feet laced up like spaghetti. It was fashion warfare, and comfort was the first casualty. And let's not pretend this was all about class. There was also a heavy dose of moral panic. Clergy members frequently preached that long-pointed shoes were a sign of vanity, arrogance, and, of course, sexual deviance. Yes, in true medieval form, there were sermons warning that overly pointy shoes were the devil's tools, leading men and women to lustful thoughts and ungodly behaviour. Because apparently nothing tempts a soul like a sharp-looking foot. Scholars still debate just how seriously these shoe laws were taken. Some argue that they were largely ignored outside major cities, and that in smaller towns people wore whatever they could afford, even if it meant looking like they'd borrowed their footwear from a jester. Others point to records of fines and confiscations, suggesting that fashion policing was very real and very personal. Imagine being hauled before the town magistrate while someone holds up your boots like damning evidence in a court of law. Is this your poulain, sir? Explain this 8-inch toe. You walk into a guild hall on business, perhaps to inquire about a new apprenticeship. But before you get 3 steps in, the doorman stops you. His eyes drop to your feet. You look down, and realise, to your horror, the curled leather tips of your shoes have drifted slightly past the acceptable limit. 3 inches, he mutters. Only barons may wear that length. You try to plead ignorance, maybe shift your weight to hide the curl. Too late. You're escorted out with a warning and a pamphlet on appropriate cobbling. Of course, not everyone hated the poulains. Some chroniclers saw them as artistic or even avant-garde. Shoe design during the period was shockingly creative. We have archaeological finds of shoes dyed bright colours, embroidered with gold, even shaped like animal heads. But always, fashion was political. The way you dressed wasn't just about self-expression. It was a public declaration of who you were, what class you belonged to, and whether you understood the rules of the game. And here's the fun irony. When the pointy shoe laws came into effect, the style quickly fell out of fashion. Not because of the laws themselves, but because styles just shifted, as they always do. Rounded toe shoes came back in style, then platform soles, then fur linings. The poulains ended up looking ridiculous and old-fashioned, and even the nobles quietly retired their lace-up danger weapons. Still, the laws lingered. For decades after the poulain had gone out of fashion, some cities still banned shoes of exaggerated point, just in case they came back. That's how badly these shoes had traumatized the population. You walk through a rainy street, boots soaked and squelching with every step. You pass a poor cobbler, hunched under an awning, hammering out a pair of sturdy, rounded clogs. Sensibly shaped, he mutters, nodding with approval. Across the road, a young dandy struts by with exaggerated pointy shoes, tied up with red ribbons. Everyone stares. An old woman makes the sign of the cross. The cobbler just snorts. He'll break both ankles before supper, he mutters. So yeah, next time you pick out shoes for fashion instead of function, remember, medieval folks literally wrote laws to stop people from getting too extra with their footwear. It wasn't just a style statement. It was a class rebellion, a moral crisis, and a tripping hazard all rolled into one. And now, you can't unsee the weaponized toe tips of history. So now that you've been kicked out of a guild hall because your shoes were too edgy, and you've had time to reflect on your sins, mostly style-related, it's time to talk about what happens when life finally catches up with you. Not romantically, not politically, but, well, biologically. You die. Sorry. And as you shuffle off this mortal coil in medieval Europe, your troubles are finally over, right? Actually, nope, not even close. Because in many cases your skeleton no longer belonged to you. It belonged to the church. That's right. In some parts of the medieval world, particularly in Catholic Europe, your body, once deceased, was not automatically destined for rest, or even for your family to bury according to their wishes. The church often claimed legal and spiritual control over human remains, and what happened next could get very weird, very quickly. Let's say you were someone of minor importance, maybe a scribe, a successful merchant, or a knight who didn't do anything legendary. You'd likely get a normal Christian burial in consecrated ground. Your bones would rest, undisturbed beneath the soil, until, of course, the church needed that grave space back. Grave plots in crowded towns weren't infinite, and bones were often exhumed to make room for newer, more recently deceased residents. What happened to the remains? Glad you asked. In many churches, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe, these bones were collected and stored in ossuaries, designated chambers, crypts, or entire underground cathedrals filled wall-to-wall with skulls, femurs and jawbones. You've probably seen pictures of the famous Sedlec ossuary in the Czech Republic, the one where they arranged the bones into chandeliers and wall art. Yeah, that was someone's grandma dangling above the altar. Why would the church do this? 2 reasons. First, efficiency. Grave space was limited, especially during plagues or wars. Second, and more unsettling, was symbolism. These bone-filled crypts were considered reminders of mortality, a kind of theological flex. Look upon these bones and remember, you too will die. So maybe tithe a little more generously this Sunday. Here's the quirky part. Not all skeletons were treated equally. If you were holy, powerful, or just lucky, your bones might be turned into a relic. That meant being chopped into smaller pieces and distributed among churches like collectible holy action figures. Your femur might end up in a cathedral in Paris, your skull in a monastery in Bavaria, your left thumb probably displayed in a glass box somewhere that charges pilgrims a few coins to look at it. Saintly remains were big business. And yes, there were arguments, sometimes violent ones, over who got to keep which bones. In one particularly absurd case, 2 churches claimed to own the same saint's head. One refused to give it up, so the other claimed they had the real one. For years, both skulls were displayed at the same time, and no one had the guts to say, "Hey, how many heads does this guy have?" Answer: too many. Now here's where things get ethically murky. In many parts of Europe, the church had the legal authority to refuse burial to anyone it deemed impure. Suicide victims, criminals, heretics, excommunicated individuals, they could be denied entry to consecrated ground entirely. Their bodies might be dumped in unmarked graves, burned, or simply left to decay. In some towns, a person who had fallen out of favour with the church could even have their remains dug up years later and reburied in a less honourable spot. Medieval posthumous cancellation was very real. Let's get to the scholarly debate. Did the church literally own your skeleton, or was that more of a spiritual claim? Some historians argue that the legal control over bodies was symbolic, meant to emphasise the church's role as gatekeeper to the afterlife. Others argue that it was more than symbolic, that ecclesiastical courts and property laws explicitly gave churches the right to move, store, and even display human remains as they saw fit. The truth is probably both. Spiritually, your soul was what mattered, but legally, Your body was subject to the whims of whoever had the biggest, oldest, and most intimidating cathedral nearby. Here's a lesser-known but delightful fact. In certain cases, nobles and monarchs requested to have specific body parts buried in different places, like, "My heart goes to Canterbury, but bury the rest of me at Westminster Abbey." Why? Partly for politics. Multiple shrines meant more pilgrims, which meant more prestige. Partly for sentimentality. One noble reportedly wanted his heart buried next to his favourite hunting dog. Look, we all grieve in different ways. You walk into a small candlelit chapel. It smells of wax and old stone. At the front, the priest waves incense over a modest coffin. After the ceremony, the gravediggers begin their work, but you notice something strange. Right beside the new plot is a pile of bones neatly stacked. Old Brother Anselm, the priest explains, moved him to make room. He's in the wall now, keeps the crypt cosy. You glance at the wall. Sure enough, there's a small skull embedded in the masonry, its hollow sockets catching the light. No one seems disturbed by this. It's just how things are done. And that's what's so strange and so deeply medieval about the whole thing. In a world where death was everywhere, on the road, in the fields, in your soup pot, you had to develop a certain practical relationship with it. Bones weren't sacred in the modern sentimental sense. They were tools, symbols, relics, warnings, and occasionally home decor. So no, your skeleton didn't belong to you, not really. It was considered a vessel. Once emptied of its soul, it became part of a bigger system. A tool for teaching humility, reverence, and sometimes just how little say you had, even after death. In medieval life, even your bones had a job to do. So your bones have been tucked neatly into a church wall, your femur possibly turned into a reliquary for pilgrims to gawk at, and your soul, hopefully, has made it somewhere less bureaucratic. Seems like the drama is over. But hang on. Let's rewind the tape back to when you were still alive, perhaps just trying to ring the church bell because it was your job, or you drew the short straw that day. And then, boom! Out of nowhere, a bolt of lightning tears down from the sky and turns the bell tower into an electrified death trap. Welcome to the bizarre and very real world of medieval fear surrounding bell ringing during thunderstorms, and the laws created to stop people from doing exactly that. It sounds wild, but people genuinely believed for centuries that ringing church bells during storms would scare away evil spirits, especially the kind of spirits that rode in on thunder and lightning. And so, naturally many churches assigned someone to go up and ring the bells as a kind of divine alarm system any time the sky started looking cranky. The logic: the sound of consecrated bells would drive off demons, bad weather, and anything else that might ruin your crops or your hair. But here's the twist. Metal bell towers plus elevated structures plus stormy weather equals lightning magnets, and the results were as gruesome as they were predictable. Bell ringers, often young apprentices or unlucky sacristans, were regularly electrocuted during storms, not once or twice. We're talking dozens, even hundreds, of documented cases where someone died doing this very job. In France alone, it's estimated that more than 100 bell ringers were killed by lightning between the 12th and 18th centuries. And it wasn't just the bell ringers, entire towers caught fire, roofs caved in, sometimes the bells themselves cracked from the sheer heat and force of the strikes. Eventually, even the most stubborn bishops started to put two and two together, and realised maybe, just maybe, God didn't want people ringing giant metal instruments at the exact moment he was throwing bolts around. This led to a slow but steady shift in church policy. By the 18th century, ringing bells during storms had been banned outright in many regions. But back in the high medieval period, it was still a heated debate. You had traditionalists who insisted that the bells had to be rung no matter what. The storm was because the bells weren't being rung early enough. Others, slightly more scientifically minded, or just tired of burying charred apprentices, started arguing for restraint. Here's the quirky side note. Some towns developed special non-metallic bell ropes or lightning rituals to help protect the ringer. A few even blessed the bell ropes with holy water, or hung small relics around the belfry to guard the space. This is like putting garlic around your Wi-Fi router and hoping it keeps the malware away. The intent was pure, the science, not so much. There's also the ongoing scholarly debate. Did people genuinely believe bells could fight storms? Or was this more symbolic? A way of expressing communal anxiety during dangerous weather? Some historians argue that bell ringing was more about social cohesion. When a storm hit, hearing those bells meant you weren't alone. It was a sonic reassurance that the community was doing something. Others point to theological tracts that genuinely believed bells had spiritual power. After all, many bells were cast with Latin inscriptions invoking divine protection and were often baptized before use. Yes, bells were given names, baptized with holy water, and treated as semi-living religious objects. You find yourself standing in a small medieval village, dark clouds rolling in overhead. The sky rumbles ominously. Inside the church, an older man nervously looks up at the tower. "Go ring the bells," the priest orders a young apprentice. The boy hesitates. "It's lightning out," he whispers. The priest shoves a blessed medallion into the boy's hand and pushes him toward the narrow, creaking staircase. You watch as he climbs, one step at a time, up toward the dark, thunder-lit rafters. The bell begins to toll, one chime, two, then a flash. A sound like the world cracking open. The bell rope snaps. The tower goes silent. No one speaks. They all just stare at the scorched rope and the tiny line of smoke curling up from the belfry window. After enough incidents like that, local councils started quietly changing their rules. Some towns banned bell ringing during active sky disturbance. Others started building lightning rods, a practice that took a while to catch on but eventually saved lives. Of course, the first people to propose it were accused of interfering with divine will, because obviously protecting your tower from lightning means you don't trust God to aim properly. Still, it was progress. And by the late medieval period, some parishes had finally acknowledged that maybe ringing bells wasn't going to stop a storm, but it might stop a few more funerals. You want another weird detail? The fear of lightning extended to church bells themselves. People believed that bells cracked by lightning were cursed, and sometimes they were buried, melted down, or hung upside down in fields as a warning. One bell in northern Germany was cracked during a storm and then chained to the floor of the church crypt, just in case it decided to call the storm back. So the next time you hear a thunderclap and instinctively reach for your weather app, take a moment to appreciate that in the Middle Ages, someone would have been sprinting to the bell tower to whack a 900-pound bronze drum and pray they didn't fry mid-prayer. It wasn't superstition to them, it was faith, it was duty, it was terrifying. And in a world where so little could be controlled, the idea that a ringing bell could hold back the sky, that was a comfort worth dying for. Alright, so you've survived the bread inspectors, the bath bans, the kissing curfews, the skeleton bureaucracy, and of course, the unfortunate lightning-related bell tower incident. By now, you might be thinking, you know what, maybe I'll just head into the woods, build a little hut and live off mushrooms. Smart plan. Except, hold on, before you wander into the forest and start living your cottagecore fantasy, there's something you need to know. You're probably not allowed to be there. Because in medieval Europe, the woods didn't belong to everyone. They were controlled, guarded, and filled with creatures you weren't even allowed to hunt, unless you had the right bloodline, the right title, or a very, very forgiving lord. Welcome to the world of medieval forest laws, where trees had more legal protection than most people, and hunting the wrong rabbit could literally get you executed. Let's start with the big one, the royal forest. That doesn't just mean a big stretch of pretty trees the king liked to picnic in. A royal forest was a specific legal designation, a zone where forest law applied, and it didn't just cover the trees. It included the animals, the rivers, the airspace, the mushrooms, the grass, the paths, and sometimes even people who happened to live there. Forest was seen as a kind of royal inheritance, especially in England after the Norman conquest. And the Normans took forest law very seriously. Here's how it worked. If land was declared a royal forest, that didn't mean it was full of pine trees. It just meant the king had exclusive rights to hunt, especially for big-ticket animals like deer and wild boar, and if you, a humble peasant, got caught chasing a rabbit, picking a flower, or gathering firewood in one of these areas, you could be charged with poaching, fined heavily, or worse. And by worse, I mean blinding or death, depending on how generous the sheriff was feeling that day. There are actual recorded cases where people were mutilated or hanged for hunting game in protected woods. Not because they were rebels, not because they were violent, just because they were hungry. Think about that. Imagine your kids are starving, you trap a deer, and suddenly you're being dragged to court for it. Forest law wasn't just about conservation, it was about power. Now here's the quirky bit. These forest animals had legal personhood in some regions. Deer, for example, were considered beasts of the chase, and killing one unlawfully was not unlike killing a nobleman's prized warhorse. They were sacred in a strange bureaucratic way, and since only nobles had the legal right to hunt them, they became a kind of walking status symbol. If you had a hunting license, it wasn't just for sport, it was proof that you were elite, and don't even think about trying to look the part. Wearing hunting gear, especially boots, cloaks, or hoods in certain colours, was itself considered suspicious. It could be used as evidence that you were a poacher, even if you hadn't caught anything. Yes, fashion again, it never ends. But here's where it gets genuinely dark. Forest law wasn't enforced by friendly park rangers. It was carried out by officials like the verderers and foresters, who patrolled the woods, collected fines, and organised public trials, sometimes held right in the middle of the forest. There were entire courts dedicated to this stuff: the Court of Attachments, the Swain Mote, and the Forest Heir. These weren't small-time operations. You could be arrested, tried, and sentenced in a court that existed only to protect the king's trees and deer. The scholarly debate here is fascinating. Was this actually about environmental preservation, or was it just elite control? Some modern historians argue that forest law was an early, if brutal, form of ecological conservation. It created protected zones where animals could thrive, and in a weird way, it kept large stretches of land from being completely deforested by farming. Others say, nice try, and point out that the laws overwhelmingly benefited the rich, punished the poor, and had little to do with sustainability and everything to do with who was allowed to kill what and where. It's also worth noting that these forests weren't just empty wilderness. People lived in them. Entire communities existed inside the boundaries of royal forests, and they had to navigate a legal minefield every day. Collecting firewood? Illegal, unless it had already fallen. Cutting down a tree? Definitely illegal. Fishing in a stream? Only if it wasn't stocked with noble fish, whatever that meant. Even gathering acorns for your pigs, called pannage, required permission. Let's get weird for a second. There are records of animals being declared off limits not because they were rare, but because they were seen as too noble to die. Like the white hart, a type of rare deer. Killing one was not just illegal, it was seen as spiritually dangerous. In one tale, a poacher who slew a white hart was said to be cursed and followed by bad luck for the rest of his life. Ghost deer. That's the level we're working with. You find yourself walking through a dense, shadowy wood, the trees towering above like cathedral pillars. You hear rustling, then the soft crunch of hooves on leaves. A stag, massive, antlers like twisted silver. You freeze. You've got a small knife in your satchel and a rumbling stomach. But then you remember, this is a royal forest. There are eyes in these trees, and not all of them belong to animals. Behind you, a voice. That yours? You turn. A man in green with a badge on his chest and a bow on his back steps out of the shadows. You don't answer. He doesn't need you to. Eventually, pressure from commoners forced some changes. Charters were issued, like the Charter of the Forest in 1217, which rolled back some of the harshest forest laws. It gave peasants limited rights to gather wood, graze animals, and access water. But the royal grip never fully loosened. The forests remained dangerous places, not because of wolves, but because of bureaucracy. So the next time you wander through a quiet park and marvel at the peace, take a second to imagine being arrested by a bow-wielding forest ranger because your pig accidentally crossed an invisible line and ate the wrong acorns. That's how the medieval woods worked. They were beautiful, yes, but they were also policed, patrolled, and absolutely not yours. You've made it out of the king's forest with all your limbs intact and miraculously no fines. That in itself is a win. So now maybe it's time to celebrate. The harvest was good. No one's accusing you of poaching, today. And the tavern down the lane is buzzing with music, laughter, and the soft clink of wooden mugs. Someone grabs your arm. They're dancing in the square, they say, eyes lit up like fireflies. But as you step outside, heart light and feet ready, a stern voice cuts through the joy. No dancing after dark. And just like that, the party ends. Because yes, medieval dancing was sometimes banned at night, and not because people couldn't keep rhythm, but because of something far more medieval, the fear of demons, disease, and moral chaos. Let's start with the basics. People loved to dance. Across medieval Europe, from dusty village squares to lavish courtly halls, Dancing was part of weddings, festivals, feast days, and even harvest celebrations. It was how people flirted, blew off steam, bonded with neighbours, or just showed off that they had slightly less arthritis than the guy next to them. Some dances were organised, like the carol, a circle dance with singing, and others were less structured, often involving spinning, clapping, and the occasional leap that made older villagers mutter "show off" under their breath. But here's the twist. The church wasn't a huge fan. Not always, not everywhere, but enough. Particularly when it came to dancing at night. Once the sun went down, the air cooled, and the shadows grew long, dancing began to look suspicious. Because in the medieval imagination, night was the devil's domain. It's when temptation stirred, virtue faltered, and things that should have been quiet got loud. Local laws began to pop up forbidding dancing after sundown, especially in or near churches. The reasoning was always a shaky mix of morality, superstition, and public order. Dancing, they claimed, led to unchaste behaviour. It stirred passions. People got handsy. There was laughing. There was, God forbid, unsupervised mingling between unmarried youths. And where there was merriment without oversight, sin surely followed. Here's a weird little fringe fact. In parts of Germany and France, authorities believed excessive dancing could spread disease, both physical and spiritual. There were even outbreaks of what's now referred to as dancing mania, events where entire groups of people would suddenly begin dancing uncontrollably, sometimes for days, until they collapsed from exhaustion or injury. The most famous instance was in Strasbourg in 1518, when dozens of people danced in the streets in a frenzy that may have been caused by ergot poisoning, mass psychosis, or just sheer medieval stress. Whatever it was, the reaction from local officials was not to look into it calmly. No, they banned dancing, built shrines, and tried to exorcise the afflicted. Now, not every law against dancing was about demonic possession. Some were just about crowd control. Dancing meant gatherings. Gatherings meant gossip, noise, and the risk of disorder. In tight medieval towns with flammable houses and narrow alleys, a crowd of tipsy peasants doing the carol in the dark could very quickly turn into a riot or an accidental fire. So curfews were placed not just on candles and soup pots, but on dancing feet. The scholarly debate here is whether these laws were actually enforced with any consistency, or whether they were just one of those things local priests preached about, but everyone ignored unless a scandal happened. Some evidence suggests that people mostly danced anyway, often in secret. There are written sermons complaining that the young dance in the moonlight like beasts, which basically means they won't stop and I'm really mad about it. And then, of course, there were class issues. Nobles could dance whenever and wherever they liked. Their dances were more formal, slower, and done indoors. They had musicians, chaperones, and wine that didn't come in clay jugs. When peasants danced in the streets, it looked wild, spontaneous, sweaty, which was fun for them, but terrifying for anyone in power. So, as always, the rules weren't evenly applied. A baron's daughter dancing by candlelight in a marble hall. Artistic. A blacksmith's daughter dancing barefoot in the mud after curfew? Scandalous. You're standing at the edge of a square. Torches flicker along the stone walls. Someone's brought out a fiddle. A beat begins, and soon, feet are stomping, skirts are twirling, and voices are rising. You watch a young couple spin and laugh, their shadows leaping like spirits on the stones. But then a bell chimes, not the joyful kind, the curfew bell. Everyone freezes. An older man hisses, "Enough. You want the watch to come down here?" The music stops. The fiddle is tucked away like contraband. Laughter becomes whispers. Feet shuffle home, and so the dance dies. Not because anyone wants it to, but because in this time joy had an official bedtime. There's also a strange religious twist to all this. Some theologians believed that dancing, especially in circles, could imitate pagan rituals. They claimed it was linked to fertility rites, moon worship, and other unchristian practices. And yes, some local laws actually included wording that described circle dances as heathenous expressions. Never mind that most dancers were just trying to enjoy themselves and not, say, summon a corn god. One document from the 13th century describes a case where a priest excommunicated an entire group of dancers for performing outside his church after hours. According to legend, they kept dancing for a year straight, cursed to move in a frenzy until they died or begged forgiveness. Whether that actually happened or just served as a cautionary tale to keep teens in check, who knows? But here's the core of it. Medieval people danced because life was hard. Really hard. Dancing was defiance. It was a release valve. When everything else was regulated, your clothes, your food, your movements, even your shoes, your body in motion might be the only freedom you had left. Which of course is why people tried to take it away. So the next time you're at a wedding or a party and you hear music kick in, take a minute to be grateful that you can join in the dancing without worrying about church spies or a city ordinance banning joy after dark. And if you happen to feel the urge to dance barefoot in the moonlight, maybe just go for it. Just don't do it near a cathedral. You never know who's watching. So after the music fades and the forbidden footwork comes to a halt, you find yourself back in the tavern, just trying to relax. Your body's tired from dancing, your soul's tired from dodging forest laws, and all you want is a cold mug of ale to dull the sting of medieval life. You walk up to the bar, smile at the innkeeper, and order your drink. He grunts, fills a wooden mug, and slides it over to you. But instead of just handing it off, he glances down at your hand, then at your belt. "Where's your mug?" he asks. And that's when you remember you were supposed to bring your own drinking vessel. Because yes, in many parts of medieval Europe, you were legally and socially expected to carry your own mug. Let's set the scene. In modern life, you go out to a bar or a cafe, and the place provides the cups. Easy, sanitary, no questions asked. But in medieval taverns, especially in rural towns and along well-travelled roads, it was totally normal, sometimes even required, for patrons to bring their own drinking vessel. Think of it as the original BYOB culture, except it stood for Bring Your Own Bowl. Why? A few reasons. First, taverns didn't always have enough clean mugs for everyone, especially during feast days, market days, or when a travelling troupe of knights showed up and decided to celebrate not dying. Second, mugs were valuable, even the wooden ones. They were hand-carved, often personalised, and hard to replace. If a tavern provided mugs for everyone, they'd constantly lose them to theft, breakage, or customers wandering off mid-hangover. So people carried their own. Many had their mug strapped to their belt or hung from a cord over the shoulder. Some had metal tankards, others used horn, wood, or ceramic. In towns with more formal alehouses, you might be provided with a mug if you were a regular, but in country inns, especially the kind with dirt floors and goats milling around, it was no mug, no mead. But here's where it gets legally weird. In some areas, local laws actually regulated drinking vessels. If you brought in a mug that held more than the standard measure, you could be accused of cheating the tavern out of profits. Likewise, if the innkeeper served ale in an undersized mug, he could be fined under the assize of ale, a law that measured both the quality and quantity of ale being sold. Yes, they literally sent officials, called ale tasters, to inspect taverns and make sure customers weren't being shorted by so much as a sip. So imagine this. You bring your own mug to the tavern, proudly hang it on the bar, and the ale taster walks in. He pulls out a standard measure, fills your mug, and watches to see how much it holds. If it holds too little, no big deal. But if it holds more than it should, the innkeeper gets suspicious. Are you trying to trick me into overpouring? Suddenly you're part of an impromptu medieval investigation over a few extra drops of barley beer? Here's a delightfully quirky fact. In some places, taverns use shared mugs attached to the bar by chains. Yes, chains. You could drink but not walk off with the mug. These were usually crude, metal-bound wooden tankards, built to survive rough handling and the occasional drunken sword fight. And you can bet that health codes were not a thing. If the last guy at the bar had a cold, well, you just inherited it. Hope your immune system's had its porridge today. Speaking of germs, that's the scholarly debate. Did medieval people actually understand disease transmission well enough to care about shared drinking vessels? Some historians argue they didn't, that the preference for personal mugs was more about tradition and property than hygiene. Others point out that folk wisdom did link sickness with proximity and sharing, and that some towns even had laws discouraging the communal use of bowls or cups during outbreaks of plague or pestilence. Either way, carrying your own mug was a handy solution, and a kind of social currency. People judged you by your drinkware. Let's not forget the social symbolism of the mug. Wealthier patrons had finely carved wooden tankards, or pewter mugs engraved with family symbols. Travellers often had collapsible horn cups, tucked neatly into leather satchels. One legend even tells of a man who drank from a silver chalice shaped like a fish, which honestly feels excessive but deeply on brand for medieval overachievers. You're in the tavern now, it's crowded. The fire crackles, music plays quietly, nothing too energetic lest the dancing demons return. A burly man beside you lifts a heavy carved mug and grins. "You a local?" he asks. You nod, reach for your drink, only to remember your mug is hanging by the hearth where you left it to dry last week. The barkeep sighs. "We got a chain mug, but it's got a wobble in it." He hauls out a lopsided wooden tankard, still damp from its last user. You smile politely and take it. Nothing like a bit of communal spirit, and possibly tetanus. Over time, of course, the practice of bringing your own mug faded. As taverns became more established and drinking customs more standardised, especially in cities, innkeepers took on the burden of providing cups, though they were often quick to demand payment if anything was broken or stolen. But the legacy remains. Even today, some pubs and beer festivals carry the tradition forward. Bring your own tankard or buy one at the door. No mug, no mead. So the next time you hit a bar and someone clinks glasses with you, just remember, in the Middle Ages, you were clinking personal property. Drinking was not just a social ritual. It was a logistical puzzle, a legal concern, and a weird little flex depending on what your mug said about you. And if someone tried to walk out with your cup, let's just say medieval bar fights weren't always about insults. Sometimes it was about tableware theft. So there you are, surviving public mug shaming in a tavern where half the clientele might be ex-poachers and the other half are just really attached to their tankards. You finally settle in, drink your ale, and share a warm, stolen moment with the person sitting across from you. You've danced under curfew, you've made it through bread inspections, and now, as the candlelight flickers and the ale starts to blur the edges of the world, you lean in close. But your beloved is heading off in the morning, hundreds of miles away, maybe to war, maybe to inherit a sheep farm. You panic. "Marry me," you say, and they say yes, but you can't go with them. So instead, you send someone else. That's right. In the Middle Ages, you could get married by proxy, without even being there yourself. It sounds like a sketch from a bad historical sitcom, but marriage by proxy was not only legal in many medieval societies, it was surprisingly common, especially among nobles and royals. The basic idea? If you couldn't attend your own wedding, someone else, usually a trusted male relative or advisor, could stand in for you during the ceremony. And yes, they go through the full motions, say the vows, offer the symbolic token, a ring, or sometimes a belt or glove, and even kiss the bride, all on your behalf. In many cases, these proxy marriages weren't even weird. They were strategic. Political alliances between kingdoms often hinged on a timely marriage. If a princess in France needed to marry a prince in Spain, they weren't going to risk months of dangerous travel just for a ceremony. Instead, she'd marry his representative, sometimes in front of a cathedral full of witnesses. Then, weeks or months later, the actual couple would meet and complete the union. Yes, in every sense of the word. One of the most famous examples is the proxy marriage of Catherine of Aragon to Prince Arthur of England in 1499. Catherine was in Spain, Arthur was in England, so a Spanish noble stood in for the prince. They went through the wedding ceremony like it was all perfectly normal, and it was, for them. For everyone else, it probably raised a few eyebrows. But here's where it gets delightfully quirky. Sometimes the proxy stood in not just for the vows, but for the entire honeymoon. Not in the literal physical sense, thankfully, but symbolically. In some ceremonies, a sword or a piece of armour was laid in bed between the bride and the proxy to represent the absent groom. It was a bizarre blend of ritual, symbolism, and awkwardness that only medieval legal minds could dream up. Marriage by proxy wasn't just for nobles, though. There are recorded cases of merchant families using the same setup. If a groom was away on business for years but wanted to lock in a marriage and its associated dowry, he could send someone to stand in for him, and once the ceremony was done, boom, contract valid, rights confirmed, dowry secured. It was essentially long-distance commitment, medieval style. Here's where the legal headache comes in. If someone got married by proxy and later refused to consummate the marriage, or if either party claimed they never truly consented, things got dicey fast. Church courts had to sort out what counted as a valid marriage. Was it the vows, the witnesses, the fact that someone else kissed your spouse for you while you were busy fighting in Flanders? There's also a particularly strange fringe case involving a woman who married a man by proxy, then learned he'd died before the ceremony even took place. Technically, she'd become a widow without ever meeting her husband. The local court, in a true moment of medieval logic, still ruled that the marriage stood posthumously. She was now a grieving widow and entitled to the dowry. This leads us to the scholarly debate. How widespread was proxy marriage really? Some historians argue it was a rare but important tool of royal diplomacy. Others say it was more common than we think, just underdocumented, especially among merchant classes. Records suggest that in many port towns and trade hubs, people used proxies to manage not just marriages, but engagements, inheritance rights, and betrothals, especially when long-distance travel was slow, dangerous, and likely to end in dysentery. You find yourself at a modest village chapel. The benches are filled with curious neighbours. At the altar stands a bride in fine linen and a slightly confused-looking older man clutching a glove. "I do, on his behalf," he says. The priest nods solemnly. The kiss is brief and awkward. Somewhere far away, the actual groom is sitting on a boat, probably unaware the ceremony is happening. You can't help but think, is this what romance looks like? Legal documents and someone else doing the kissing? Still, there's something oddly touching about it. For all its legal tangles and proxy awkwardness, the system reflects a certain determination. People were willing to twist logic and ritual into pretzels just to make their commitments work. Travel was slow, war was common, death was always hovering. But if two people wanted to tie their lives together, even oceans apart, they'd find a way, even if that meant sending cousin Bernard to say "I do" in your place. Eventually, proxy marriages began to fade, especially with improved travel and communication. The Church also started emphasizing the importance of mutual consent, present and clear, between both actual parties. But the legal echoes lingered for centuries. In fact, some countries still recognize proxy marriage in certain circumstances, like for military personnel or people imprisoned. So next time someone tells you long-distance relationships never work, remind them that in the Middle Ages people literally got married without showing up. They mailed in their vows, sent a stand-in, and hoped the other person didn't die before the paperwork cleared. It wasn't perfect, but somehow it worked. So, you've survived a proxy wedding, maybe not your own, but you were at least emotionally present, and now you find yourself with one foot in a tavern and the other in the town square, trying to wrap your head around a society where you can marry someone by sending a guy with a glove, but still get fined for dancing after sunset. Seems chaotic, doesn't it? But nowhere is that chaos more deliciously strange than in the kitchen, or more specifically, the bakery, because if you're planning to sell bread today, make sure it's made properly, and not just in terms of size or freshness. No, in many parts of medieval Europe, it was illegal to sell bread without salt. Sounds like a weird flex, right? But salt was a huge deal in the Middle Ages, so important in fact that laws were created to control how it was used, bought and sold, especially in everyday staples like bread. And if you skipped it, whether to save money, out of forgetfulness, or because you were experimenting with some kind of low-sodium fad before it was cool, you could face actual legal consequences. Let's break it down. Bread, as we've already discussed, wasn't just food. It was a fundamental pillar of survival, especially for the lower classes. So it had to meet certain standards, or chaos would follow. People didn't line up every morning at the bakery just to grab a croissant for fun. They depended on bread, and they expected it to taste and last a certain way. And salt played a huge role in that. Not only did salt improve flavour, but it also preserved bread, helped control the fermentation process, and, not insignificantly, had spiritual symbolism. In Christian tradition, salt represented purity and incorruptibility. Bread without salt was to some unclean, insulting, maybe even demonic depending on which preacher was giving the Sunday sermon. In parts of Germany and France, town guilds had strict regulations about bread making. Salt had to be included in specified quantities, and it had to be of a certain quality. If you tried to cut corners, used muddy salt from an unapproved source, or skipped it entirely, you risked being hauled before the guild tribunal. They'd weigh your loaves, sniff them, sometimes even taste them. It wasn't just about making a product. It was about upholding civic responsibility through carbs. Here's the quirky fringe fact. In a few regions, if a baker was found guilty of omitting salt, their punishment was to be publicly paraded with a loaf of their own saltless bread hung around their neck. Imagine the shame of walking through your village while the kids point and whisper, "That's the no-salt guy." Worse, in Italian cities like Florence, saltless bread was associated with poverty, stinginess, or outright incompetence. Selling such a loaf wasn't just a culinary error, it was a social statement, and not a flattering one. Now, ironically, Tuscany is famous today for its traditional unsalted bread, pane sciocco, which pairs beautifully with salty meats and cheeses. But that trend started for an entirely different reason: tax avoidance. Back in the 12th century, when Pope Gregory VII and various Italian states were beefing, the Papal States started taxing salt heavily. So the Tuscans said, fine, we just won't use it. That led to an entire regional cuisine built around the absence of salt, turning resistance into flavour. Salt rebellion, basically. But in most of medieval Europe, that trick wouldn't fly. Salt was essential, and salt laws were everywhere. In some towns, bakers were required to buy their salt directly from a state-licensed supplier, ensuring both quality and a juicy tax revenue stream. These laws were so well enforced that bakers would sometimes be randomly inspected, with officials cracking open loaves and checking for proper salt content. If the bread tasted bland, the baker paid the price. And this leads us into the open, scholarly debate. Were these salt laws about food quality or control? Some argue that the laws were genuinely about protecting consumers from bad bread. Saltless loaves went stale faster and could breed mould. Others point to the central role of salt taxes in medieval economies. Salt was heavily regulated not just because of health, but because it was lucrative. Governments didn't want people going rogue, harvesting their own salt from marshes, smuggling it, or skipping it entirely. So they made salt mandatory in food staples like bread, where they could monitor it easily. You walk into a bustling stone bakery, the air thick with flour dust and the scent of rising dough. The baker, sleeves rolled to the elbows, pulls a tray from the oven. He eyes the loaf closely, then sighs. Too light. I knew it, he mutters. Forgot the salt. He turns and sees the guild inspector at the door. You watch the baker's shoulders sink as he takes a long piece of twine and ties the offending loaf around his neck like a shameful pendant. Better than a fine, he mutters, or another sermon from Father Louis. And here's the thing. People took these laws seriously because bread riots were real. If a town's bread was bad, underweight or flavourless, things got tense. Famine made people desperate. Bad bread made them furious. And salt, scarce, precious, powerful, was a lightning rod. One cracked crust could set off a week of unrest. Even today, echoes of these laws survive. In parts of Europe, bread is still highly regulated, with rules about size, ingredients, and even fermentation time. France's famous baguette, for instance, is legally defined by its ingredients and process. And while no one's making you wear a shame loaf these days, there's still a kind of public judgment that lingers around bland or lazy bread. So the next time you tear into a warm, salty slice of anything, take a moment to appreciate that for much of human history, this wasn't just food. It was politics. It was law. It was the thin, crunchy line between civil order and total chaos. And if you ever find yourself running a medieval bakery, just remember, no salt, no soul. So you've learned the hard way that bread without salt might get you publicly humiliated, and you've made your peace with the idea that even your kitchen has legal boundaries. But it's Sunday again, which means everything grinds to a halt. The streets are quiet, the market stalls are shuttered, and the only people walking around are headed to church, or home from it. It's supposed to be a day of rest, reflection, and the occasional heavily edited sermon about fire and eternal suffering. You think you'll take a stroll just to enjoy the fresh air, maybe hum a tune to yourself, but be careful, because in many medieval towns, singing in the streets on Sundays wasn't just frowned upon, it was forbidden. Yep, you read that right. Singing. Not offensive songs, not drunken ballads, not protest chants, just singing, period, at least in public, and especially near a church. It might seem like an innocent pastime to us, but in the Middle Ages, singing outside the bounds of approved spaces and times was a moral and legal offence in more places than you'd expect. Let's dig into why this was such a big deal. Medieval societies, particularly in Europe, were obsessed with order, especially when it came to the sacred calendar. Sundays weren't just rest days, they were mini holy days, and every town treated them with a blend of reverence, fear, and what can only be described as spiritual micromanagement. You were supposed to go to Mass, avoid labour, and spend the rest of the day in quiet, God-honouring behaviour. And singing, even cheerful singing, was seen as disruptive to the sacred atmosphere of the day. In some towns, municipal codes spelled it out clearly. No public singing on the Sabbath, lest the pious be distracted. This rule applied not just to performers or troubadours, but to anyone. If you were a shepherd whistling while walking your flock, or a child singing a rhyme as you skipped down the lane, someone could report you. And if that someone was a local church official or town guard, you'd get a fine, or worse, a public scolding. Which might not sound bad, until you've been forced to stand at the edge of the church green while the priest explains to your neighbours that your humming nearly derailed someone's path to salvation. The quirky bit. Music was everywhere in medieval life. People loved it. They sang while working, drinking, walking, grieving. They had songs for planting, harvesting, kneading dough, putting babies to sleep. It was how people told stories, remembered history, and expressed joy. But, as with dancing, the authorities drew a hard line between appropriate music and sinful noise. So what counted as sinful? Well, it depended on the town, the decade, and the local clergy's mood. In many places, religious singing inside a church was encouraged, even required. Choral music, plainchant psalms, these were seen as offerings to God. But sing those same words outside in the market square, suddenly it was irreverent, even mocking. Even secular songs that had nothing to do with religion could be targeted if they were perceived as drawing people away from the proper spirit of the Sabbath. And of course, there were exceptions for the rich. Nobles who hosted Sunday feasts on their estates could have music, private performances, harpists, singers, as long as it was behind closed doors. Because it wasn't the sound itself that offended people, it was who was making it, where, and why. If you were a lowly tradesman walking home and broke into a tune, you were being disrespectful. If you were a baron drinking wine from a goblet that cost more than a shoemaker's home, that was refined. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these anti-singing laws actually enforced, or were they symbolic warnings? Some historians believe they were mostly idle threats, rolled out occasionally when things got especially rowdy. Others point to real court records where people, especially young men, were fined for singing bawdy songs in public on holy days. One document from a town in Flanders notes that a group of teenagers was forced to sweep the church steps for a week after singing drinking songs within earshot of the vicar's house. Not exactly capital punishment, but the message was clear. Tone it down. And let's not ignore the darker side of this. Singing wasn't just a legal issue. It could also become a moral panic, especially during times of social stress, like famines, plagues, or wars. In those moments, any noise that seemed frivolous or joyful was viewed with suspicion. How can you sing, the logic went, when God is clearly angry? There are accounts of towns where music was banned entirely during Lent, Advent, and long after a tragedy. Singing too soon after a flood or a bad harvest was seen as ungrateful, almost blasphemous. You find yourself wandering through a sleepy village on a Sunday afternoon. The church bells have long since stopped ringing. The sun is low. Children play quietly with hoops and sticks. You're in a good mood, humming a soft tune your grandmother used to sing. Then you hear the unmistakable clack of boots behind you, a town official wearing a brown cloak and an expression that says he hasn't smiled since the last crusade. The Lord's Day is for silence, he says, not ditties. You stop humming. He walks on, the village stays quiet. Of course, people still sang, just like they still danced. They just did it in private, behind doors or far out in the fields, where no one could hear but the cows. Music wasn't going to disappear because of a town ordinance. It was too deeply woven into everyday life. So people found ways to adapt. Songs were shortened. Whistles were disguised as bird calls. Children made up hymns that sounded suspiciously like drinking songs. It was rebellion, sure, but soft melodic rebellion. Eventually attitudes softened. As musical instruments became more common and church music evolved into grander, more elaborate forms, the line between sacred and secular started to blur. Towns began to sponsor public festivals that included music, even on Sundays, especially if the festival was in honour of a saint or a local miracle. Singing became permissible again, as long as it was the right kind of song, and you weren't enjoying yourself too much. So the next time you're walking down the street with headphones in and singing a little too loud, be thankful you're not being shadowed by a church warden with a citation scroll and an ear for unchaste harmonies. In the Middle Ages, even joy had to be scheduled, monitored, and measured in decibels, and God help you if you were off-key. After being shamed into silence on a sunny Sabbath stroll, you head home with your dignity mostly intact and the rebellious chorus of a forbidden folk tune still bouncing round your skull. You reach your cottage, light a small beeswax candle, and settle in with a hunk of salted bread, because you're not making that mistake again. But as the evening rolls on and the flame flickers, a new problem creeps into your mind. You remember something your neighbour told you earlier, something whispered like a warning. Make sure your candles are out by curfew, or the fire watch will fine you. And just like that, you realise your house has a candle curfew. That's right. In many medieval towns, especially in dense urban areas, it was legally required that all candles, lanterns and hearth fires be extinguished or safely covered by a specific hour, usually signalled by the curfew bell. These weren't just polite suggestions, they were municipal mandates, often enforced by nighttime patrols, neighbourhood informants, and occasionally a literal sniff test from the town's watchman. At first glance, it might sound like the medieval version of your dad telling you to turn off the lights and go to bed. But these rules weren't about saving energy, they were about saving lives. Cities in the Middle Ages were fire traps, constructed largely of wood, thatch, pitch and hope. One candle knocked over, one hearth left smouldering, and an entire street could vanish overnight. And it happened. Frequently. Because of this, fire laws became increasingly strict, and curfews weren't just for people, they were for flames. The moment that bell rang out across the rooftops, your home was expected to go dark. In some towns, officials even enforced a rule that hearths had to be covered at night, usually with a thick metal or ceramic fireplate, to prevent embers from sparking during the night. Now here's the quirky twist. The name curfew actually comes from the Old French curfew, literally cover fire. That's where the whole concept originates. It wasn't originally about getting you into bed by a certain time. It was about covering your fire before it burned down your neighbour's stables, and people were expected to comply. In England, France, parts of Italy, and much of the Holy Roman Empire, there were fire marshals or constables tasked with making nightly rounds to inspect windows, sniff the air for smoke, and fine violators. If your window glowed too long after curfew, you might find a knock at your door, or worse, your name read aloud at Sunday services as someone who endangered the neighbourhood. The fines varied. In wealthier towns, you might pay a few coins. In poorer villages, you might owe labour or public shaming. Repeat offenders could lose their right to own a hearth, or be forced to cook at the communal oven under supervision. Imagine needing permission to make soup because you forgot to snuff your candle one too many times. And of course, just like with fashion, bread, or literally anything else, class mattered. Nobles often had servants who managed their fires for them. Wealthier homes could afford safer materials like iron grates and tiled hearths. They were also more likely to have multiple rooms, each with its own fireplace, meaning they had more fires to cover, but also more space to distance themselves from disaster. Meanwhile, in a peasant's one-room hut, everything you owned could go up in smoke because of a single ember. Fire was an equaliser, but the law, not so much. Let's step into the scholarly debate for a moment. Were these fire curfew laws actually enforced with consistency? Some argue yes, especially in larger cities where a single blaze could wipe out entire districts. Records from places like London, Ghent and Florence detail numerous fines for fire violations. Others suggest the rules were more of a preventative measure, rarely enforced unless something actually caught fire, kind of like posting a speed limit on a road no one patrols until someone crashes. There's even evidence that certain fire rules were seasonal. During dry summers or windy seasons, towns became hyper-vigilant, sometimes banning open flames entirely after sunset. In those months, even lighting a lamp might get you a fine unless you had a license or a strong alibi. Just looking for my sock wouldn't cut it. And here's the strangest part. Some towns went full surveillance mode. There were actual edicts that required neighbours to report each other for post-curfew firelight. That's right. Early neighbourhood watch, but with more pitchforks and fewer pamphlets. If your neighbour saw smoke or candlelight, they were legally obligated to turn you in. And if they didn't, they could be fined too. Medieval mutual destruction. Flame edition. You sit in your cottage, the fire crackling softly as the sun vanishes behind the hills. The curfew bell tolls, one long, low note that seems to sink into your bones. You look at the flickering hearth, still warm from the evening stew. You take a heavy iron lid and place it carefully over the fire, muttering a little prayer under your breath. Not to God exactly, but to the fire. Stay quiet, you whisper. Behave. The room plunges into shadow, Outside, footsteps echo, leather boots, metal buckles, the sound of someone checking for trouble. You hold still until they pass. Of course, people got creative. Some used glowstones or embers kept in clay pots to relight fires quickly in the morning without breaking the curfew rules. Others made charcoal blocks that smouldered slowly and safely overnight. These were the medieval equivalents of leaving your phone plugged in under your pillow. Risky, but convenient. Eventually, as buildings improved, firefighting equipment evolved, and cities developed more formal emergency responses, the strictness of candle curfews began to fade. But the laws lingered in some places for centuries, especially in older towns where narrow streets and timber walls remained dangerously flammable. And even now, if you travel to some preserved medieval villages in Europe, you might see signs or plaques that reference old fire curfews. Not as active laws, but as grim little reminders. This town once burned, and someone probably forgot to cover the fire. So next time you light a candle before bed, think about the thousands of people across centuries who had to do the same, and then snuff it out, just in case someone outside the window was watching. Because in the Middle Ages, fire didn't just warm your home, it could condemn it. So here you are, safely tucked away in your fire-compliant home, no flames flickering after curfew, no one singing scandalous tunes outside your window, and your bread appropriately salted and approved. You might think this is the closest you'll get to peace in medieval life, but just when you start to relax, clang, the church bell tolls. You peek outside and see a familiar sight, a man in robes, riding past with a sword at his side. Not a knight, not a soldier, a clergyman, and you're not hallucinating. Because yes, in the Middle Ages, even though clergy were technically banned from bearing arms, many of them absolutely did it anyway. And if you're wondering how a man could hold both a cross and a crossbow, you're not alone. Let's get this straight. Clergy were not supposed to be armed. Canon law, which governed the religious class in much of Europe, was pretty clear. Priests and monks were men of peace. They were not to shed blood, take up weapons, or engage in secular violence. Theoretically, if you were ordained, you were on a spiritual path that excluded martial behaviour. But of course, this was the Middle Ages, where almost everything came with a giant asterisk and an unspoken "unless it's convenient." In practice, many members of the clergy, especially the higher-ups, carried weapons, owned weapons, trained with weapons, and in some cases led troops into battle. Bishops, abbots, and even monks weren't always content with just prayers and parchments. They had lands to defend, political alliances to uphold, and enough gold and farmland under their control to attract thieves, enemies, and very ambitious neighbours. So what do you do when someone threatens your monastery's cheese stockpile? You arm up. Now here's where the legal loophole comes in. Canon law technically forbade clergy from shedding blood, but not from carrying a weapon that didn't draw blood. Enter the mace, the bludgeon of choice for holy men who wanted to thump their enemies into submission, without technically violating the letter of the law. You've probably heard the rumour about medieval bishops riding into battle with ornate maces instead of swords, smiting their enemies with sanctified force. And while it's been exaggerated a bit in popular imagination, there's truth to it. A bishop with a mace wasn't just a myth, it was a workaround. The quirky bit? Some monks belonged to military orders, like the Knights Templar or the Knights Hospitaller, who were both monastic and militarized. These were the religious equivalents of warrior monks, sworn to celibacy and daily prayer, but also fully trained in combat, armed to the teeth, and more than willing to enforce religious aims with the pointy end of a sword. They were given papal approval to fight in defense of the faith, which made them walking contradictions, and very effective ones. Even in smaller monasteries, local politics could pull clergy into conflict. There are records of abbots leading armed retinues to defend church property, settle land disputes, or support the king in times of rebellion. In England, the Bishop of Durham was known as a prince bishop, a spiritual leader who also controlled a massive swathe of land and had his own private army. He issued his own laws, collected taxes, and could sentence criminals, so naturally he also had a sword, sometimes several. This leads us to the scholarly debate. Did clergy really fight, or did they just look like they did? Some historians argue that most armed clergymen were figureheads, present in armour, but not actively swinging weapons. They were there for morale and authority. Others point to chronicles and court records that mention priests fighting, bleeding, and dying in battle, just like any knight. So the reality probably lies somewhere in between. Plenty of clergy were happy to delegate the bloodshed, but when push came to shove, and when a rival baron was invading their abbey, they didn't hesitate to pick up a weapon. You walk along the edge of a dusty road, the bell tower behind you chiming the hour. Up ahead, a rider approaches, a man in dark robes, a wooden cross hanging from his neck, and a long curved sword swinging from his belt. You nod politely. He returns the gesture, then says, "Bandits on the road. I'm just being cautious." He rides on, robes fluttering, sword glinting in the sun. You wonder how many sermons end with a drawn blade. Of course, this double identity caused friction. Many reform movements within the church tried to crack down on armed clergy, insisting that religious men had to choose between the sword and the staff. But in regions where the church held significant political power, those reforms often fell flat. After all, if you were both bishop and baron, no one could really force you to disarm. One particularly famous case involved Bishop Odo of Bayeux, half-brother to William the Conqueror. He not only helped finance the Norman invasion of England, but also fought in it, mace in hand, on horseback. He even appears in the Bayeux tapestry, swinging his weapon as casually as one might bless a loaf of bread. And when the Pope later reminded everyone that clergy weren't supposed to fight, Odo more or less shrugged. "Well," he might have said, "I didn't shed blood." Eventually, as European warfare became more organised and nation-states started consolidating power, the sight of armed clergy became rarer. The church pushed harder for separation between spiritual duties and secular violence. By the Renaissance, most bishops preferred pens to swords, though the occasional rogue abbot still picked a fight when necessary. So next time you picture a medieval priest, don't just imagine him tucked away in a scriptorium, copying texts by candlelight. Imagine him in chainmail, on horseback, a prayer on his lips and a mace in his hand, ready to defend his sheep in every sense of the word. Because in the medieval world, faith and force were often neighbours, sometimes uncomfortable ones, sometimes wielding the same weapon, and somewhere deep in the woods a bandit learns the hard way not to underestimate a man in robes. By now you've probably noticed a theme. Nearly everything in the medieval world, your clothes, your candles, your bread, your romantic life, was governed by some oddly specific rule, often enforced by someone with a scroll, a frown, and a strong belief in public shaming. But few areas of daily life were policed as aggressively, or as creatively, as the way you dressed. Enter the fascinating world of sumptuary laws, medieval fashion legislation designed to remind you, in case you forgot, exactly how low you were on the social ladder. Sumptuary laws were basically the medieval version of stay in your lane, except the lane was your wardrobe, and the punishment for stepping out of it might involve a fine, a confiscated hat, or being escorted through town as a walking cautionary tale. These laws dictated what colours, fabrics, styles, and even types of accessories you were legally allowed to wear, based entirely on your social class, gender, profession, and marital status. The idea behind these laws wasn't new, it dates back to ancient Rome, but medieval Europe took it to new levels of obsessive detail. In England, for example, a law from the 14th century specified that anyone below the rank of knight couldn't wear gold, silver, or embroidered silk. No fur-lined cloaks, no elaborate belts, no fancy buttons. Yes, even buttons were regulated. Because apparently a nicely tailored outfit was the first step towards social collapse. Why all the fuss? The official reasoning was always the same, to preserve the natural order of society. Clothing was seen as a visual cue of your place in the world. If a merchant started dressing like a noble, or a butcher wore velvet to Sunday Mass, how was anyone supposed to tell who deserved respect and who didn't? Chaos. Absolute chaos. But beneath the surface there was a messier truth. These laws were about fear. Fear that the growing merchant class, flush with cash from trade and commerce, might start looking and acting like aristocrats. That they'd blur the carefully maintained lines between bloodlines and bank accounts. After all, if a wealthy wool merchant could wear the same red cloak as a baron, what was to stop him from demanding the same seat at court? And then there was the church's spin on things. Clergy routinely preached against luxurious dress as a form of pride and vanity. They warned that expensive clothes were a gateway to sin, especially if worn by women. One bishop famously described silk as the skin of lust itself, which is both dramatic and frankly a little too poetic. But the sermons worked. People became suspicious of fine clothing, unless it was worn by someone obviously noble or devout. Here's the quirky twist. These laws didn't just restrict the lower classes, they also forced the upper classes to dress up, a lot. Nobles were required to wear specific markers of status like jewelled collars or intricate embroidery so they could be recognised instantly. It wasn't just about dressing well, it was about dressing visibly rich. If you failed to display your wealth adequately, you risked being mistaken for a commoner, which was, in its own way, a social crime. The consequences for breaking sumptuary laws varied by region and decade. Sometimes it was a fine. Other times the offending garment would be confiscated and displayed publicly as a warning to others. In extreme cases, particularly in cities like Florence and Venice, the wearer might be paraded through the streets, forced to explain their crime. Imagine trying to explain to a crowd that you wore illegal shoes because your only other pair had a hole. You're walking through a bustling town square when a young woman catches your eye. She's wearing a rich green velvet dress trimmed with fur, a belt with tiny silver bells. She looks stunning. But then, from across the square, 2 city guards approach. One pulls out a scroll. "You are a merchant's daughter," he says, "not the wife of a knight." The woman flushes. Her father nearby tries to argue. "I bought the cloth myself." The guards don't care. They unpin her belt, roll it up and walk off with it. Proof of a law enforced. Her dress stays, but the message is clear. Next time, wear wool. The scholarly debate around sumptuary laws is a juicy one. Some historians argue they were largely unenforceable and symbolic, used more to promote ideals than control actual behaviour. Others point to the many, many court records where people were fined for wearing the wrong hat or trimming their tunic too elaborately. The truth likely lies in the middle. Enforcement was patchy, but the threat of enforcement was enough to shape people's choices. Fear is a great tailor. There's even evidence that sumptuary laws were used as political tools. A king might relax clothing laws to curry favour with the merchant class, then tighten them again when the nobility complained. It was fashion diplomacy, and it worked surprisingly well. And let's not forget the comedy of errors these laws created. Tailors had to memorise dozens of legal restrictions to avoid sewing something that could get them or their client fined. Merchants sold noble look-alike fabrics that skirted the rules, but gave you that baronial drip. One Italian city tried to ban women from wearing gowns with trains longer than 6 feet, only to realise no one could agree on where the train officially began. Eventually, many sumptuary laws fell out of favour, not because people stopped caring about class, but because fashion moved faster than the law could keep up. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the lines blurred. Wealth shouted louder than birth, and no one wanted to enforce laws that made half the town illegal. Still, the next time you pull on a jacket with gold trim or walk out in your comfiest silk scarf, remember, once upon a time, someone would have taken that off you in public and charged you for the privilege. In the medieval mind, fashion wasn't just personal. It was a statement of loyalty, faith, and rank, and wearing the wrong thing could mean more than just a raised eyebrow. It could mean public humiliation, confiscation, or even a permanent note in the town ledger. Dressed above her station, twice. Let's pause for a moment and think about hands. Most of the time they go unnoticed, chopping firewood, kneading dough, swatting flies, maybe making a slightly rude gesture behind a passing noble's back. But in the Middle Ages your hand said a lot about you, and if you were left-handed, well, that said something very specific, that you might be in league with the devil. Seriously. For centuries in courts, churches and schools, being left-handed wasn't just inconvenient, it was suspicious. In some places it was downright illegal to use your left hand for certain tasks. This wasn't just a quirky superstition tucked away in some obscure corner of medieval thought. Left-handedness was seen across much of Europe as a mark of evil, sin, or moral weakness. The Latin word sinistra, meaning left, is where we get the modern word sinister. Meanwhile, dexter, or right, is the root of dexterity, meaning skill or grace. The right hand was the hand of blessing, of writing, of swordplay, of shaking hands. The left hand, that was the unclean side associated with black magic, heresy, and all the stuff your priest warned you about while pointing aggressively at the pulpit. And it wasn't just words, it was law. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in monastic schools or guild apprenticeships, using your left hand was explicitly banned, particularly for writing, signing legal documents, or participating in ceremonies. Scribes caught using their left hand could be punished, retrained, or even expelled. In court, if someone signed their name with their left hand, it might cast doubt on their character or the legitimacy of the document. Left-handedness was seen as non-compliance with divine design, a subtle rejection of the natural order. Now, if you're thinking, okay, that seems excessive, you're right. But remember, this was a time when people interpreted everything through symbolic frameworks. The world was seen as full of cosmic mirrors, heaven and hell, light and dark, right and left. The right side of the body was linked to masculinity, authority and power. The left side, femininity, weakness, temptation. Sorry, lefties. You had a branding problem. And here's where things get even weirder. In combat, being left-handed gave you a distinct advantage, especially in sword fights. Most people were trained to defend against right-handed opponents. A left-handed fighter could throw off their enemy's rhythm entirely. Some duelists even faked left-handedness to confuse their rivals. So what did medieval fencing schools do? They often forced left-handed students to fight right-handed, not for safety, but for orthodoxy. There's one recorded case from a 13th century fencing guild where a student was denied advancement because he refused to submit his sinful hand to correction. Yes, that's an actual quote. The same hand that might win a duel could lose you a license, an apprenticeship, or a spot at the banquet table. But the bias wasn't limited to combat or writing. In religious rituals it mattered too. When receiving communion, it had to be in the right hand. When swearing an oath, same thing. Even blessings were delivered with the right hand. A priest who accidentally used his left might have to repeat the entire ritual, depending on how strict his superior was. And as for the devil, he was said to whisper in the left ear. Of course. That's why some people wore protective charms on their left side. There's a delightful little fringe fact here. In some rural parts of Europe, midwives were told to correct infants who showed signs of favouring their left hand by tying it behind their back. This wasn't just a light encouragement. It was a physical restraint meant to train the child into righteousness, one spoonful at a time. A left-handed toddler with a spoon in the wrong hand was not just quirky, they were a theological problem. You're walking through a dusty monastery courtyard when a young novice bumps into you, parchment under one arm, ink smudges on both sleeves. He's been practicing calligraphy. You glance down and notice the quill is in his left hand. He quickly switches it to the right, blushing. "Don't tell Brother Gerard," he mutters. "He says the devil guides my wrist." You nod slowly, not sure what to say. Then he adds, "Still writes straighter than Gerard, though." Fair point. Of course, not all regions or periods were equally hostile. Some areas, particularly in the later Middle Ages, began to ease up. As literacy expanded and more secular schools opened, left-handedness was sometimes tolerated, especially if the student was talented or wealthy. But it remained a stigma, and not one that went away quickly. Even centuries later, school teachers were still smacking left-handed students with rulers and forcing them to switch. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these anti-left-handed laws were codified or just culturally enforced. Some say it was more of a social pressure, an unspoken bias. Others point to educational records, court documents, and religious texts that explicitly describe the correction of the left hand as both necessary and moral. Either way, the result was the same. Left-handed people often had to learn to live right-handed, or at least pretend to. And here's the tragic irony. Left-handedness is neurological, not behavioural. It's not a choice. Trying to change it can lead to long-term issues, especially with motor skills, memory and confidence. So when medieval society punished lefties, they weren't just forcing conformity. They were forcing neurological rewiring, with all the unintended consequences that came with it. Eventually, left-handedness lost its moral stigma, though it took a painfully long time. By the early modern period, some artists, musicians and warriors began to embrace it as a mark of uniqueness. But in the Middle Ages, it made you a suspect, a walking question mark, a person whose hands didn't follow the rules of heaven and earth. So next time you shake someone's hand, pass a cup or write your name, take a second to appreciate the quiet freedom of choice. Because not so long ago, the wrong hand could cost you your reputation or your place at the table, and if you're left-handed, just know you would have survived the Middle Ages, but probably with a few bite marks on your knuckles and a suspiciously neat right-handed signature. By this point you've managed to survive the Middle Ages with your bread salted, your candles snuffed, and your left hand tucked politely behind your back. You've outwitted forest rangers, side-eyed sword-swinging bishops, and learned not to dance after dark unless you really, really mean it. But now you're just trying to get through the week and keep your household afloat. You've been tasked with baking a few loaves, something sturdy, hearty, maybe with a little barley to stretch the wheat. You measure carefully, weigh the flour, shape the dough, but then you freeze. because in medieval towns, if your loaf doesn't meet the exact expected weight, you might start a riot. Yes, that's not an exaggeration. In the Middle Ages, bread weight was a civic obsession, and bakers were held to standards so strict they make modern food regulations look positively lazy. Bread wasn't just food, it was life. And if the local bakery shorted you even slightly, the townspeople didn't just complain, they revolted. So in response, cities passed laws that turned bread weight into a legal affair, complete with inspections, fines, and occasionally public beatings. The most famous of these laws comes from England, the Assize of Bread, first enacted in the 13th century. It established specific weights and prices for bread based on the fluctuating cost of wheat. The law was updated constantly, sometimes weekly, and every baker was expected to follow it with obsessive accuracy. If the price of wheat went up, the bread got smaller. If wheat got cheap, the loaves got bigger, and heaven help the baker who tried to cheat the system by making a too light loaf while grain prices were low. Now here's the catch. Most people couldn't read the ever-changing weight charts, so how did they know they were being shorted? They didn't, they just felt it, and often they were right. A lighter loaf was obvious, and when food was scarce you noticed every missing crumb. To combat fraud, officials called ale conners and bread weighers were dispatched to monitor bakeries. They carried scales, test loaves, and a keen sense of righteous fury. If a baker was caught selling underweight bread, the punishment wasn't subtle. First offence, a fine, maybe public shaming. Second offence, you might be paraded through the streets with your bad bread tied around your neck like a necklace of dishonour. Third offence, you could be put in the pillory, have your oven destroyed, or, if things got really bad, be banned from baking for life. And here's the quirky detail. This is exactly why the baker's dozen came into being. Bakers were so nervous about underweight loaves that they routinely added an extra one to every dozen, just to be safe. So when you buy 13 muffins today and think, wow, what a generous tradition, you're actually honouring a time when bread laws were so severe that bakers started throwing in bonus carbs to avoid jail. There are even town records of bread riots breaking out over disputes about weight. In one 14th century French town, a baker's apprentice sold slightly underweight loaves during Lent. When discovered, he was chased into the street by furious townspeople, who then stormed the bakery and burned it down. The authorities? They mostly just shrugged and fined the baker for disturbing the peace. But it wasn't just the public that was watching. Monasteries, which often had their own bakeries, enforced even stricter standards. Monks who undermeasured bread could be flogged, assigned extra fasting days, or demoted to latrine duty. Some abbeys even kept weight logs going back decades, tracking how their bread sizes fluctuated with harvests, weather, and inflation. That's right, monks were the original food inspectors, only with more ink stains and less patience. You wander through a cobblestone market as vendors shout prices and chickens roam freely. A baker calls out, offering fresh rye loaves stacked neatly on a wooden board. You approach, pick one up. It feels light. Too light. A nearby customer notices your hesitation and narrows her eyes. "Weigh it," she mutters. The baker stiffens. A nearby boy runs off and returns with a city officer, who pulls out a small iron scale and a counterweight. Everyone watches. The loaf comes in just under regulation. The officer glares. The baker sighs. Fine, he can have it for free. The crowd nods. Crisis averted. For now. The scholarly debate here is over whether these laws were genuinely enforced in all towns, or just in large, centralised areas. Some researchers argue that in rural villages things were looser, and people just bartered by feel. But others point to records showing regular inspections, even in the smallest parishes. Bread was simply too important to leave to chance. It was tied to health, happiness, and social stability. A town that let its bakers run wild risked more than just bad crusts. It risked open rebellion. What's more, the obsession with bread weight tied directly into medieval concepts of justice and fairness. The idea was that the poor, who lived mostly on bread, deserved consistency. Their lives were unstable enough. War, plague, weather, taxes. The one thing they could count on, ideally, was a loaf of bread that weighed what it was supposed to. The law became a kind of moral anchor, and the baker was expected to uphold it like a priest upholding scripture. Eventually, with the rise of centralised governments and the advent of coin-based economies, bread pricing became more flexible. But the memory of those strict laws lingers. Even today, certain European countries have standards for what constitutes bread. France's baguette laws, for example, still specify weight, ingredients, and baking methods. So next time you walk into a bakery and pick up a loaf that feels just a little too airy, think back to the days when that could have started a riot. And if the baker looks nervous, maybe don't ask for a scale, just order a baker's dozen and hope they're still terrified of tradition. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't mess with someone's bread. By now, you've evaded a dozen laws, kissed in secret, worn only the most legally appropriate shoe shapes, and survived a brush with underweight bread and the wrath of the village weighing officer. You deserve a break, maybe even a bit of exercise. But in the Middle Ages, leisure wasn't really a thing, at least not for commoners. So if you were lucky enough to be a knight, or just training to be one, guess what you got instead of weekends? Mandatory combat practice. That's right. In some parts of medieval Europe, especially in the later Middle Ages, knights were legally required to train on holidays. No jousting in July, no sword drills in spring. Forget it. If it was a feast day or a Sunday afternoon, and you were of noble blood or held land in exchange for military service, you were expected to be out in a field, sweating through your armour while some lord's son took a wooden lance to your ribs. Because nothing says sacred day of rest like organised violence in full-plate mail. Now, here's how this worked. During times of peace, lords and kings still needed to make sure their fighting men didn't get soft. So they passed laws and issued edicts requiring regular martial exercises. These weren't private hobbies, they were feudal obligations. Just like you owed your lord taxes or service in war, you also owed him a sword arm that didn't wobble from too much ale and not enough sparring. Some regions scheduled formalised training days, often falling on religious holidays or feast days, when townspeople would gather to watch knights and squires go through drills, sparring and mounted combat. It might sound strange, forcing someone to work on a holiday, but in the medieval mind, it made perfect sense. Feast days meant crowds, and crowds meant a chance to show off military readiness. And if you were a noble, being seen in public, in armour, displaying your skill with a sword, was part of maintaining your status. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about performance. If you tripped over your own sword belt in front of your vassals, you'd never live it down. And these weren't casual sparring matches either. In places like France, England and the Germanic states, there were entire events built around tournaments and mock battles, often sanctioned by law. Sometimes, participation was required to prove your ongoing value as a vassal. If you skipped out too often, you could be summoned to court and questioned about your loyalty, or worse, lose favour with your liege lord. The quirky fringe fact. There were laws governing how rough the practice could get. For example, during certain feast day tournaments, knights were only allowed to use blunted weapons, and in some towns, they had to sign agreements not to intentionally maim each other. You know you're living in a particular kind of world when "please don't decapitate your sparring partner" has to be written into law. And yet, accidents still happened. Broken bones, concussions, even deaths. A 15th century account from Burgundy describes a squire who accidentally killed a nobleman during a training bout and was fined an entire year's income and had to donate a stained glass window to the local cathedral. Of course, some lords were lenient, treating these sessions more like pageantry than preparation. But others, especially in frontier regions or unstable territories, were strict. If you were part of a noble household, you were expected to train regularly. It wasn't optional. It was part of your legal identity, just like your coat of arms or your manor house. To be a knight was to be ready. And that brings us to the open scholarly debate. Were these laws really enforced, or were they more symbolic expectations? Some historians argue that most training requirements were loose, suggestions, not mandates. But others point to land records, charters, and legal documents that tie feudal obligations directly to combat preparedness. In some cases, lords withheld privileges, or even land, from knights who failed to train or appear in arms on the appointed days. That's a steep price to pay for skipping sword day. And it wasn't just nobles. In some towns, citizen militias were required to train on Sundays. These were groups of craftsmen, merchants, and freemen expected to defend the town if needed. They'd assemble in the town square, go through drills, and then, after proving they could still hold a spear without stabbing each other, maybe enjoy a barrel of ale. It was part security, part social club, and entirely embedded in local law. You walk past a field on the edge of town. It's a feast day, St. Crispin's maybe. The townsfolk are setting up for festivities, tables covered in cloth, roasted meats, a fiddler warming up nearby. But in the field, a group of knights and squires are thudding around in armour, practising strikes and parries. One squire takes a clumsy swing and gets knocked flat by a knight with better footwork and no patience. From the sidelines, a clerk takes notes. He's not writing poetry, he's marking attendance. And yes, someone had to record these events. Town officials, estate clerks, and even church scribes would often track who showed up, who fought well, and who looked like they'd rather be napping. These records helped lords decide promotions, land grants, and occasionally who was worthy of leading troops in battle. Here's something you might not expect. Some feast day training sessions became major social events, with games, prizes, and dances afterward. The line between training and spectacle blurred. Swordplay became entertainment, and mandatory practice turned into a performance for the townsfolk. If you won your bout, you might receive a purse of coins. If you lost badly, well, maybe your pride hurt more than your body. Either way, the message was clear. Skill at arms wasn't just a private virtue, it was a public duty. Eventually, as gunpowder transformed warfare and centralised states developed standing armies, the practice of mandatory training days began to fade. But for centuries, it was law. If you held land under a king or duke, you didn't get to choose whether or not you fought, and training was part of that contract. So the next time you're tempted to skip a gym day or flake on a scheduled group activity, just be glad there's not a man in chainmail knocking on your door with a clipboard and a very dull longsword, asking why you weren't at the field this morning, practicing your thrusts in front of a crowd of drunk merchants. In the Middle Ages, even your holidays came with homework and bruises. So now you're nursing a bruised rib from mandatory sword drills, trying to remember whether you bowed too shallowly to the local baron, while also making mental notes not to hum on Sundays or let your candle flicker after curfew. It's been a long week. You're exhausted. You deserve a bath, a hot one with maybe some herbs tossed in, lavender if you're fancy, nettle if you're stubborn. You head into town to the local bathhouse, only to stop short. There's a sign nailed to the door, in bold script, closed until further notice, on account of morality. Because in medieval times, bathing was often banned, not for health reasons, but for moral ones. That's right. The same society that policed your bread and your buttons also had serious feelings about your bath schedule. And sometimes, those feelings turned into actual legislation. Depending on where you were and when you lived, public bathing was illegal, restricted, or discouraged, all in the name of public decency, spiritual purity, or good old-fashioned paranoia. To be clear, medieval people did bathe, much more than the old myths suggest. There were bathhouses in towns across Europe, especially in the early and high Middle Ages. They were social spaces, a bit like spas or community centres. You'd soak in heated water, get scrubbed down, gossip with your neighbours, and maybe even enjoy some music or a light meal. It wasn't exactly a Roman luxury bath, but it wasn't a mud puddle behind the pig pen either. So what went wrong? How did the humble bath end up on the legal chopping block? The short answer, people got nervous. Nervous about sin, nervous about disease, nervous about what happened when you mixed warm water, bare skin, and too much unsupervised relaxation. You can imagine the kind of things people worried might go on behind the steamy walls of a public bathhouse. And eventually that nervous energy hardened into laws and moral restrictions. In many towns, especially during the later medieval period, bathhouses became associated with vice. Some were thinly veiled brothels, others genuinely tried to remain respectable, but once the rumours took root, it didn't matter. Church authorities began to preach against public bathing, claiming it encouraged lust, vanity, and the temptation of fleshly pleasures. And because everything was tied to sin back then, governments followed suit. The law started to roll in. No mixed-gender bathing, no bathing after sundown, no bathing on holy days. Then came complete shutdowns during periods of heightened moral panic, like during Lent or after outbreaks of the plague, when public health fears and religious guilt got tangled into one big, sweaty, underwashed mess. Here's the fringe fact that'll make your shampoo recoil in horror. During plague years, some cities banned bathing entirely out of the belief that hot water opened your pores and made you vulnerable to disease. Yes, the idea was that washing made you more susceptible, so they encouraged people to seal their pores with dirt and sweat instead, which of course was great for everyone's social lives. Now, not all regions followed this path equally. In southern Europe, places like Italy and Spain, bathing remained more culturally accepted for longer, especially among the wealthy. But in northern Europe, particularly parts of Germany, England and Flanders, bath bans became increasingly common by the 14th and 15th centuries. Some towns even passed laws that fined bathhouse operators for allowing men and women to bathe in the same building, let alone the same tub. You're walking down a narrow street in a chilly English town. Smoke rises from chimneys, and somewhere in the distance a donkey sneezes. You spot a small stone building with steam trailing from its roof, a rare sign of warmth. But as you approach, you see the door barred shut and a local constable standing nearby. "Closed," he says. "Council says too many folk getting ideas in there." You shiver. "Ideas?" He nods grimly. "Naked ones." You turn back into the cold, dirt now officially part of your winter wardrobe. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these bath bans really about morality, or about control? Some argue that local governments used bathhouse closures as a way to clamp down on gatherings they couldn't supervise. After all, bathhouses were often places where people talked freely, shared news, traded information, and in some cases organised resistance to unfair taxes or unpopular lords. Others argue that the bans were less about control and more about fear of disease, fear of sin, fear of bodies, particularly the idea that comfort might lead to corruption. It's worth noting that bathhouses weren't always filthy dens of vice. Many were quite clean, maintained by strict guilds who kept water fresh, temperature regulated and services respectful. There were even rules about what kinds of soaps could be used and how often linens were washed. But it didn't matter. Once the idea took root that public bathing equaled private sin, the steam-filled rooms began to vanish. Of course, the rich still bathed. They had private tubs, private attendants, and access to herbs and oils commoners couldn't dream of. The laws weren't aimed at them. They were aimed at you, the average person looking for a little hygiene and a break from medieval grime. You were told to scrub yourself with a cloth, maybe rinse with a small basin of lukewarm water once a week. And if you smelled, well, everyone else did too. Nose blindness was your only hope. And what happened when bathing was restricted? Perfume use skyrocketed. Herbal satchels, scented oils, and pomanders, little balls filled with spices, became the deodorant of the day. People tucked them into clothes, wore them on belts, or just clutched them while walking through crowds. Bathing was suspicious, but smelling nice, that was divine. Eventually, of course, bathing made a comeback, thanks to the Renaissance, the printing press, and the slow realization that maybe hot water wasn't a gateway to hell after all. But for a few grim centuries, cleanliness was next to godlessness, and the law made sure you knew it. So the next time you take a hot shower after a long day, think about your medieval counterpart, hunched over a cold basin, scrubbing behind their ears with a scratchy rag, while a priest outside preaches about how soap makes you prideful. And remember, in the Middle Ages, even washing your armpits could be a punishable offence. You've officially given up on being clean. The bathhouse is barred shut, your scented herbs ran out 3 days ago, and you're starting to wonder if the lingering smell of turnips and wool is just your new natural aura. You could go lie in a stream, sure, but then someone might report you for unsanctioned aquatic activities. So, you decide to distract yourself the old-fashioned way. Gossip. And what better place to hear the latest tales than the local tavern? You step inside, order a drink, and lean in as the whispers start. But careful, because in medieval towns, spreading rumours could get you fined, branded, or even run out of town. Welcome to the odd world of anti-gossip laws. Now everyone gossips. It's practically a universal human pastime, older than fire and more addictive than salted bread. But in the Middle Ages, gossip wasn't just idle chatter. It was dangerous. It could ruin reputations, disrupt marriages, sow distrust, and most terrifying of all, lead to actual unrest. Town councils, village courts, and church authorities all knew one thing. Words could topple more than just friendships. They could topple entire communities, so naturally they passed laws to stop it. In many medieval towns, especially across England, France, and the Low Countries, there were specific ordinances against scandal-mongering, idle chatter, and defaming words. These weren't vague warnings either. Some laws went into stunning detail, listing particular phrases that could land you in court. Accusing someone of theft, promiscuity, heresy, or even laziness could earn you a public penalty if you couldn't prove it. If you said someone watered down their wine or cheated at market scales and they took offence, you'd better have a witness, or prepare to stand in front of the village with a sign around your neck that read, "Liar." And let's be clear, this wasn't about protecting feelings. It was about maintaining order. In a world where family honour was everything, and revenge was often just one insult away, keeping a lid on community tension was critical. Gossip was treated like a spark in a dry haystack, seemingly small, potentially catastrophic. A whisper could lead to a duel, a rumour could lead to a riot. The legal term often used was defamation, and medieval defamation cases were a common feature of local courts. Some areas had entire scolding courts, dedicated to sorting through these interpersonal flame wars. In these courts, women were disproportionately represented, not because they were more gossipy, but because the law presumed they were. That brings us to one of the weirdest punishments ever devised, the scold's bridle. This device, also called the brank, was a metal cage fitted over the head, often with a plate that pressed into the tongue to prevent speech. Offenders were marched through the town square while wearing it, sometimes with bells attached to draw attention. And yes, it was gendered, almost exclusively used on women. The reasoning? Society decided that a scolding woman, a term that basically meant too opinionated, was a threat to moral stability. But men weren't safe either. In some towns, male gossips were punished with stocks, fines, or public confessionals. One German town's records list a case where a merchant accused another of sleeping with the butcher's wife. He couldn't prove it, and instead of a duel, he was ordered to pay for a barrel of wine for the entire town as a symbolic gesture of apology. Costly mistake, that one. And then there were eavesdropping laws. Yes, even listening to gossip could get you in trouble. If you were caught loitering near windows, under eaves, hence the name, or near fences to overhear private conversations, you could be fined. Medieval communities treated privacy with an almost suspicious intensity. What was said behind closed doors should stay there, or else. You sip your mug of ale and listen to two townsfolk bickering quietly in the corner. One whispers that the baker's apprentice has been sneaking extra loaves to the blacksmith's daughter. The other gasps and says it's because she's promised to another. A barmaid walks past and catches the end of the sentence. Her eyes narrow. "You didn't hear that from me," she mutters, and disappears into the back room. You get the sense that the tavern has ears, and maybe a few informants. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these gossip laws really about truth, or were they tools for social control? Some argue they were designed to protect reputations and keep peace in tightly knit communities. After all, when you live in a town of 300 people, a single rumour can follow you for life. Others see it differently. They argue these laws were ways to silence dissent, especially among the lower classes and women. A town council could punish rumour that sounded a lot like political criticism. A priest could suppress accusations of corruption by calling them slander. It wasn't always about harmony, it was often about power, and it gets even more twisted. In some places, gossip wasn't just a civil offence, it became a spiritual one. The church classified certain types of speech as sinful. Calumny, spreading lies, detraction, telling truths that damage reputations, and idle chatter, basically talking too much for no good reason. Penances for these sins range from reciting psalms to public apologies from the pulpit. Yes, you could be forced to confess your gossipy sins in front of your entire parish, right after the homily, probably while sweating and trying not to make eye contact with the people you'd offended. Eventually, as printing spread and literacy increased, gossip laws began to shift. People could write their thoughts anonymously, pamphlets, letters, wall posters, and pin them up where no one could trace the source. It was harder to punish speech when it stopped being a spoken rumour and became a mass-produced whisper. But for centuries, the spoken word remained dangerous. So the next time you find yourself whispering to a friend about something scandalous you overheard at work, just be grateful there's no brank waiting for you in the closet, no stocks with your name on them, no clerk writing down hath spread falsehoods about you Cooper's marriage in a dusty court ledger. Because in the Middle Ages you really could talk your way into trouble. So here you are, muddy, mildly bruised, and officially afraid to open your mouth in public. You've been through it all, the bread drama, the button patrols, the curse of having the sinful hand, and the fine line between festival and felony. But now, just as you think the worst is behind you, you hear it. The toll of a bell. Not the church bell, not the curfew bell. This one has a sharpness to it. It means trouble. A man runs past yelling something about the baker's barn going up in flames. Another shouts about a stolen goat, and suddenly people are pouring into the square. Why? Because someone's about to raise the hue and cry. Now, in modern terms, that sounds like a dramatic indie band or a really enthusiastic group chat. But in the Middle Ages, hue and cry was a literal legal obligation. If you saw a crime, say, a theft, an assault, or someone setting fire to your neighbour's haystack, you were legally required to make as much noise as humanly possible. You were to shout, ring bells, bang on doors, even blow a horn if you had one. The goal? Alert the entire community that a criminal was on the loose. But it didn't stop at shouting. That was just the beginning. Once the hue and cry was raised, everyone who heard it was required by law to join the chase. Not just guards, not just the town reeve, everyone. From the blacksmith to the schoolboy to the grandmother with bad knees. If you were able-bodied, or even moderately hobbling, you were expected to drop what you were doing and help catch the suspect. This was law, not optional. If you failed to join the chase, you could be fined, jailed, or held partially responsible for whatever the criminal did next. That's right. Medieval justice wasn't just a matter of catching the bad guy, it was a community performance, and missing your cue could cost you. The roots of the hue and cry system go back to the Anglo-Saxon era, and it was formally codified under laws like the Assize of Arms and various town statutes across England and France. The core idea was that justice was a group responsibility. In a world without standing police forces, CCTV or criminal databases, catching a thief meant literally chasing them down in a mob. And it wasn't just dramatic flair. The hue and cry was surprisingly effective, especially in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's face, tunic and suspicious goat. You could run, but you probably weren't going far. Roads were rough, woods were full of prying eyes, and every village had its own version of a wanted wall, usually just a place where locals carved names or left charcoal sketches on wooden posts. Here's the quirky twist. The hue and cry could be abused. Some people raised false alarms, either to harass enemies, create distractions for real crimes, or just stir up chaos. This led to laws against malicious raising of hue and cry, which carried serious penalties. In one recorded case, a woman in York accused her neighbour of stealing a chicken, raised the alarm and caused a manhunt that lasted 2 days. The chicken turned up in her own garden. She was fined and forced to stand in the square holding the very chicken, which feels like justice served extra crispy. Another odd detail, you didn't actually have to witness a crime in progress. If you arrived at the scene and saw signs of a crime, an open lock, a broken window, a bloody boot print, you were still expected to raise the hue and cry. And once the bell was sounded or the call made, the local constable took over. He'd organise search parties, question witnesses, and often lead the pursuit himself. Think of him as the manager of the neighbourhood mob. You're sitting in the tavern again, finally starting to enjoy your hard-earned mug of ale, when the cry goes up, "Thief! Thief in the stable!" The room erupts, chairs scrape, mugs spill, boots pound. You're pulled into the chaos before you can even swallow. Out into the street, down the alley, past confused chickens and a startled cat. The thief has a head start, but not much. He's carrying something awkward and jingling. It's the innkeeper's coin chest. He stumbles. A child throws a stone. Someone else tackles him into a pile of hay. You stand there, breathless, unsure whether to cheer or vomit. And here comes the scholarly debate. Was the hue and cry system truly effective policing, or just mob rule in fancy script? Some historians praise it as a workable system in a world without formal law enforcement. It was participatory, swift, and had the advantage of local knowledge. Others point out that it often led to mistaken identity, wrongful punishment, and in some cases, violent revenge disguised as justice. Because let's face it, when a crowd is involved, things can escalate. And escalate they did. There are accounts of suspected criminals being caught and beaten before any formal charges were brought. In theory, the hue and cry was supposed to end with the suspect being brought before a magistrate. In practice, sometimes the crowd decided that the accused had looked guilty enough and skipped the whole trial thing. Not exactly a model of due process. Still, for all its flaws, the system reflected a core medieval value. You were responsible not just for yourself, but for your neighbours. If someone broke the law, the community answered. It wasn't about calling a number or filing a report. It was about presence, participation, and yelling loudly in the middle of town until something was done about it. Over time, as professional policing evolved and towns grew larger, the hue and cry faded. By the 17th century, it was more ceremonial than functional, though some rural areas held on to it much longer. Today the phrase survives mostly in idioms and historical footnotes, but once upon a time it was the backbone of neighbourhood justice, equal parts public service, civic duty, and impromptu cardio session. So the next time you hear someone shouting in the street and your first instinct is to pretend you didn't notice, just be grateful you're not legally bound to chase them down with a pitchfork and a gang of very excited cobblers. Because in the Middle Ages, justice came on foot and it came loud, and so here we are, you've made it. Somehow, against all odds, you've survived the world of medieval weirdness, one baffling rule at a time. You navigated the bread laws with a wary eye on your scales, buttoned your clothes according to your social rank, kissed your beloved in legal time slots, and fought mock battles on your holy days. You've learned not to bathe too publicly, not to sing too loudly, not to wear the wrong fur, and definitely not to wave your left hand around in polite company. Honestly, if medieval life was an escape room, you'd be a champion by now. But now it's night time again. The hearth is safely covered, your candle's out, because yes, the curfew bell tolled a while ago. You've resisted the urge to gossip, you haven't committed any bread crimes, and nobody's raised a hue and cry over your suspiciously well-stitched tunic. You lie back on your straw mattress, still wearing your sumptuary-approved undergarments, and stare up at the rafters, thinking about how bizarrely intricate and alarmingly specific your life is under this mountain of rules. And yet, here's the strange thing. All those weird medieval rules, they weren't as ridiculous as they first seemed. Sure, they sound like something out of a bureaucratic fever dream, but when you really squint at them, beneath the surface of fines and fashion edicts and bread inspections, they reveal a society trying, desperately, to hold itself together. A world without modern science or police or public health, doing its best to maintain order, identity and survival. The rules might seem absurd now, but back then they were lifelines. Weird, tangled lifelines, but lifelines all the same. A way of saying, we don't have it all figured out. But if everyone sticks to their lane, maybe, just maybe, we'll make it through the next winter. And that's kind of beautiful in a please don't wear ermine if you're a Cooper's wife sort of way. So, as you drift off tonight, imagine the flickering torchlight outside your window, the quiet footsteps of a watchman on patrol, and the soft echo of a distant church bell marking the passage of time. Maybe even imagine a group of monks arguing about soap, or a baker nervously weighing a loaf while a child counts the coins, or someone whispering something they definitely shouldn't in a crowded tavern. The Middle Ages were strange, messy, rigid, and wonderfully human. Sleep well, time traveller, you've earned it.